The Royal Bengal Mystery by Satyajit Roy. Chapter 1. Old Man Hollow, Pace to Follow, People's Tree. 10:30, half again, Century. Rising sun, whence it done, can't you see? Between hands, below them stands, yours it be. Feluda said to me, "When you write about our adventure in the forest, you must start with this puzzle." "Why? We didn't get to know of the puzzle until we actually got there." "I know, but this is just a technique to tickle the fancy of the reader." I wasn't happy with this answer. Feluda realized it, so a couple of minutes later he added, "Anyone who reads that puzzle at the outset will get the chance to use his own intelligence, you see?" So I agreed to start my story with it. I should, however, point out at once that it's no use trying to work out what it means. It's not easy at all. In fact, it took even Feluda quite a long time to discover its meaning, although when he eventually explained it to me, it seemed simple enough. In talking about our past experiences, I have so far used real names and real places. This time, I have been specifically asked not to do so. I had to turn to Feluda for advice on fictitious names I might use. "You can mention the place was near the border of Bhutan. There's no harm in that," Feluda said. "But you can change its name to Lakshmanbari. The chief character might be called Mr. Sinha Roy. Many old Zamindar families used to have that name. In fact, some of them originally came from Rajputana. They came to Bengal and joined the army of Todamal to fight the Pathans. Then they simply stayed on, and their descendants became Bengalis." I am doing what Feluda told me to do. The names of places and people are fictitious, but not the events. I shall try to relate everything exactly as I saw or heard it. The story began in Calcutta. It was Sunday, 27th May. The time was 9:30 a.m. My summer holidays had started. Of late, the maximum temperature had hit 100 Fahrenheit, so I was keeping myself indoors, pasting stamps from Bhutan into my stamp album. Feluda had recently finished solving a murder case, catching the culprit by using a common pin as a clue, which had made him quite famous. He had also been paid a fat fee. At this moment he was resting at home, stretched out on a divan, reading Thor Heyerdahl's Aku Aku. A minute later, Jatayu turned up. Lalmohan Ganguly, alias Jatayu, the writer of immensely popular crime thrillers, had started visiting us at least twice a month. The popularity of his novels meant that he was pretty well off. As a matter of fact, he was once rather proud of his writing prowess. But when Feluda pointed out dozens of factual errors in his books, Lalmohan Babu began to look upon him with a mixture of respect and admiration. Now, he got his manuscript corrected by Feluda before passing them on to his publisher. Today, however, he was not carrying a sheaf of papers under his arm, which clearly meant that there was a different reason for his visit. He sat down on a sofa, took out a green face towel from his pocket, wiped his face with it, and said, without looking at Feluda, "Would you like to see a forest, Felubabu?" Feluda raised himself a little, leaning on his elbow. "What is your definition of a forest?" "The same as yours, Felubabu. Cluster of trees, dense foliage, that sort of thing." "In West Bengal?" "Yes, sir." "Where?" "I can't think of any other place than the Sundarbans or Terai." Everything else has been wiped clean. Have you heard of Mahitosh Sinha Roy? The question was accompanied by a rather smug smile. I had heard of him too. He was a well-known shikari and a writer. Feluda had one of his books. I hadn't read it, but Feluda had told me it was most interesting. Doesn't he live in Orissa, or is it Assam? Feluda asked. No, sir, Lalmohun Babu replied, taking out an envelope from his pocket with a flourish. He lives in the Duers forest, near the border of Bhutan. I dedicated my latest book to him. We have exchanged letters. Oh, you mean you dedicate your books even to the living? Perhaps I should explain here the business of Lalmohun Babu's dedications. Nearly all of them are made to famous people who are now dead. The Antarctic Anthropophagi was dedicated to the memory of Robert Scott. The Gorilla's Grasp said, in the memory of David Livingstone. And the Atomic Demon, which Feluda said was the most nonsensical stuff he had ever read, had been dedicated to Einstein. Then, when he wrote the Himalayan Hemlock, he dedicated it to the memory of Sir Edmund Hillary. Feluda was furious at this. Why, Lalmohun Babu? Why did you have to kill a man who's very much alive? What? Hillary is alive? Lalmohun Babu asked, looking both apologetic and embarrassed. I didn't know. I mean, he hasn't been in the news for a long time, and he does go about climbing mountains, doesn't he? So I thought perhaps he had slipped and, well, you know. His voice trailed away. The mistake was rectified when the second edition of the book came out. Mahitosh Sinha Roy might be a well-known shikari, but was he really as famous as all these other people? Why was the last book dedicated to him? Well, you see, Lalmohun Babu explained, I had to consult his book, The Tiger and the Gun, quite a few times when I was writing my own. In fact, he added with a smile, I used a whole episode. So I felt I had to please him in some way. Did you succeed? Lalmohun Babu took out the letter from its envelope. Yes. He wouldn't send an invitation otherwise, would he? Well, he may have invited you, but surely he didn't include me? Lalmohun Babu looked faintly annoyed. Look, Felu Babu, he said, frowning. I know you would never go anywhere unless you were invited. You are well known yourself, and you have your prestige. I am well aware of that. What happened was that I told him that the book had seen 4 editions in 4 months. And I also told him, only a hint, that is, that I knew you. So he sent me this letter. Read it yourself. We have both been invited. The last few lines of Mahitosh Sinha Roy's letter said, I believe your friend Pradosh Mitra is a very clever detective. If you can bring him with you, he might be able to help me out in a certain matter. Please let me know if he agrees to come. Feluda stared at the letter for a few moments. Then he said, Is he an old man? What do you mean by old? Lalmohun Babu asked, his eyes half closed. Say, around 70? No, sir. Mr. Sinha Roy is much younger than that. His writing is like that an old man's. How can you say that? This writing is absolutely beautiful. I agree, but look at the signature. I think the letter was written by his secretary. It was decided that we would leave for Laxmanbari the following Wednesday. We could go up to New Jalpaiguri by train. After that, we'd have to go by car to Laxmanbari, which was 46 miles away. Mahitosh Babu had already offered to send his own car to collect us at the New Jalpaiguri station. It came as no surprise to me that Feluda agreed to visit a forest so readily. My own heart was jumping with joy. The fact was that one of our uncles was a shikari as well. Our ancestral home was in the village of Shonadigi, near Dhaka. My father was the youngest of 3 brothers. The oldest worked as the manager of an estate in Mymensingh. He was renowned in the area for having killed wild deer, boars, and even tigers in the Madhupur forest to the north of Mymensingh. The second brother, Feluda's father, used to teach mathematics and Sanskrit in a school. However, that did not stop him from being terrific at sports, including swimming, wrestling, and shooting. Unfortunately, he died very young after only a brief spell of illness. Feluda was 9 years old at the time. Naturally, his father's death came as an enormous shock to everyone. Feluda was brought to our house and raised by my parents. My own father has never shown any interest in anything that calls for great physical strength, but I do know that his willpower and mental strength is much stronger than most people's. Feluda himself has always been fascinated by tales of shikar. He has read every book written by Corbett and Kenneth Anderson. Although he has never been on a shikar, he did learn to shoot and is now a crack shot. There is no doubt in my mind that he could easily kill a tiger, should he be required to do so. He has often told me that the mind of an animal is a lot less complex than that of humans. And the simplest of men would have a more complex mind than a ferocious tiger. Catching a criminal was therefore no less difficult than killing a tiger. Feluda was trying to explain this to Lalmohan Babu in the train. Lalmohan Babu was carrying the first book Mahitosh Roy had written. The front page had a photograph of the writer, which showed him standing with one foot on a dead Royal Bengal tiger, a rifle in his hand. His face wasn't clear, but it was easy to spot the set of his jaws, his broad shoulders, and an impressive moustache under a sharp, long nose. Lalmohan Babu stared at the photo for a few seconds and said, "Thank goodness you're going with me, fellow Babu. In front of such a personality, I would have looked like a worm." Jatayu's height was 5'4", and at first glance his appearance suggested that he might be a comedian on the stage or in films. Anyone even slightly taller and better built than him made him look like a worm. Certainly, when he stood next to Feluda, the description seemed apt enough. "What is strange," he continued, "is that although that this is his first book, and he began writing at the age of 50, it reads as though it's been written by an experienced writer. He has a wonderful style." "He probably turned to writing when hunting as a sport was banned by the Indian government," Feluda remarked. "Many other shikaris have proved to be skillful writers. Corbett's language is beautiful. Perhaps it's something to do with being close to nature. Think of the sages who wrote the scriptures. Didn't they live in jungles?" I had noticed lightning ripping the sky soon after we left Calcutta. By the time we reached the new Farakka station, it was past midnight. I woke when the train stopped to find that it was pouring outside, and there was frequent thunder. However, when we alighted at New Jalpaiguri in the morning, there was no evidence of rain, although the sky was overcast. The man who had been sent to meet us turned out to be Mahitosh Babu's secretary, Torit Sengupta. He was under 30, thin, fair, wore glasses with thick black frames, and his hair was dishevelled. He greeted us politely, but without any excessive show of warmth. I told myself hurriedly that it might not necessarily mean he was displeased to see us. Feluda had warned me often enough not to jump to conclusions or judge people simply by their outward behavior. But Mr. Sengupta was clearly an intelligent man, for he didn't have to be told who amongst us was Ramohan Ganguly and who was Pradosh Mitter. We stopped for 10 minutes to have toast and omelettes. Then we climbed into the jeep waiting outside. Our luggage consisted only of 2 suitcases and a shoulder bag. There was plenty of room in the jeep to sit comfortably. Mr. Sinha Roy sent his apologies for not being able to receive you himself, Mr. Sengupta said before we started. His brother has not been keeping well, so he had to stay home because the doctor was expected. This was news to us. None of us knew Mahitosh Babu had a brother. I hope it's nothing serious, Feluda asked. I could tell he wasn't happy about staying in a house where someone was ill. Our visit might well turn into an imposition on our host. No, Mr. Sengupta replied. Devtosh Babu, that's his brother, doesn't have a physical problem. His problems are mental, and he has been, well, not quite normal for many years. But don't get me wrong, he isn't mad. In fact, he seems fine most of the time. But occasionally he gets very restless, so the doctor has to put him on sedatives. How old is he? 64. He's older by 5 years. He was once a very learned man. He has an extensive knowledge of history. I looked out of the jeep. To the north were the Himalayas. Somewhere in that direction lay Darjeeling. I had been there 3 times, but never to Lakshmanbari. It wasn't very warm, as there was no sun. The scenery changed as soon as we left the town. We passed a few tea estates. Now I could see mountains even to the east. Bhutan, Mr. Sengupta said briefly, pointing at these. The tea estates gave way to forests soon after we crossed the river Teesta. At one point, we saw a herd of goats emerging from a wood. Ramohan Babu got very excited and shouted, "Look! Deer! Deer!" At least he didn't say tigers. Thank heaven for that, Feluda muttered under his breath. There is a forest called Kalbani within a mile of where we live, Mr. Sengupta informed us. It was once full of tigers, many of which were killed by the Sinha Roys. Now, I'm not sure if any Royal Bengals are left, but about 3 months ago there were rumours of a man-eater in Kalbani. Rumours? How do you mean? Well, the body of an Adivasi boy was found in the jungle. There were scratches on it that suggested it had been attacked by a tiger. Just scratches? Didn't the tiger eat the flesh? Yes, the flesh was partially eaten, but a hyena or a jackal may have been responsible for that. What did Mahitosh Babu have to say? He wasn't here at the time. He had gone to visit his tea estate near Hasimara. The officers of the forest department thought it might be a tiger, but when Mr. Sinha Roy got back, he said that couldn't be. A lot has been done in these few months to find that tiger, without success whatsoever. I see. No one else was attacked after that one incident? No. The very mention of a man-eater gave me goose pimples. But Mahitosh Babu must have been right. Ramohan Babu said, "Highly interesting," and began staring at the trees, a frown across his brows. We crossed a small river, went past a village and another forest, and turned left. The road was unpaved here, so our ride became noticeably bumpy. It did not last for very long, however. Only 5 minutes later, I saw the top of a building, towering over the trees. The rest of it came into view in a few moments. The trees thinned out to reveal a large mansion that stood behind tall iron gates. Once it must have been white, but now there were black marks all over its walls, making the whole house look as if it had been attacked and left badly bruised. Only the window panes glowed with colour. Not a single one from the colours of a rainbow was missing. The gates were open. Our jeep passed through them and stopped at the portico. I noticed a marble slab on the gate that said, "The Satyajit Roy Palace." Chapter 2. Mayutosh Satyajit Roy turned out to be a little different from his photograph. The photo had not done justice to his complexion. He was remarkably fair. His height seemed nearly at the same as Feluda's, and he had put on a little weight since the photo had been taken. His voice was deep and strong, enough to frighten a tiger if he simply spoke to it, I thought. He met us at the front door and ushered us into a huge drawing room. "Please sit down," he invited warmly. Feluda mentioned his writing as soon as we had all been introduced. "The events you describe are amazing enough, but even apart from those, your language and style are so good that from the literary point of view as well, I think you have made a remarkable contribution." A bearer had come in and placed glasses of mango sherbet on a low table. Mayutosh Babu gestured at these and said, "Please help yourselves." Then he smiled and added, "You are very kind, Mr. Mitter. It may be that writing was in my blood, but I didn't know it until 4 years ago when I first started to write. My grandfather and father were both writers. Mind you, I don't think their forefathers had anything to do with literature. We were originally Kshatriyas from Rajputana." "Oh, you knew that, did you?" "So, once we were in the business of fighting with other men. Then we left the men and turned to animals. Now I've been more or less forced to abandon my gun and pick up a pen." "Is that your grandfather?" Feluda asked, looking at an oil painting on the wall. "Yes, that is Adityanaran Satyajit Roy." It was an impressive figure. His eyes glinted. In his left hand was a rifle, and the right one was placed lightly on a table. He looked directly at us, holding himself erect, his head tilted proudly. His beard and moustache reminded me of King George V. My grandfather exchanged letters with Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. He was in college at the time Devi Chaudhrani was published. He wrote to Bankim after reading the book. "The novel was set in these parts, wasn't it?" "Yes," Mayutosh Babu replied with enthusiasm. "The Teesta you crossed today was the Srota river described in the book. Davy's barge used to float on this river. But the jungles Bankim described have now become tea estates." "When did your grandfather become a shikari?" Lalmohan Babu asked suddenly. Mayutosh Babu smiled. "Oh, that's quite a story," he replied. "My grandfather was very fond of dogs. He used to go and buy pups from all over this region. There was a time when there must have been at least 50 dogs in this house, of all possible lineages, shapes, sizes, and temperament. Among these, his favorite was a Bhutanese dog. There is a Shiva temple near here called the Temple of Jilpeshwar. The local people hold a very big fair here during Shivratri. A lot of people from Bhutan come down for that fair, bringing dogs and pups for sale. My grandfather bought one of these, a large, hairy animal, very cuddly, and brought it home. When the dog was 3.5 years old, he was attacked and killed by a cheetah. Grandfather was then a young man. He decided he would settle scores by killing all the cheetahs and any other big cats he could find. He got himself rifles and guns, learned to shoot, and then, that was it. He must have killed around 150 tigers in 22 years. I couldn't tell you how many other animals he killed. They were endless. And you? I. Mahitosh Babu grinned, then turned to his right. Go on, Shashanka. Tell them. I noticed with a start that while we were all listening to Mahitosh Babu's story, another gentleman had quietly entered the room and taken the chair to our left. Tigers? Why, you have written so many books. You tell them. Shashanka Babu replied with a smile. Mahitosh Babu turned back to us. I haven't been able to reach 3 figures, I must admit. I killed 71 tigers and over 50 leopards. Meet my friend, Shashanka Sanyal. We have known each other since we were small children. He looks after my timber business. There seemed to be a world of difference between Mahitosh Babu and his friend. The latter was barely 5 feet 8 inches tall. His complexion was dark, his voice quiet, and he spoke very gently. Yet, there had to be some common interest to hold them together as friends. Mr. Sengupta mentioned something about a man-eater. Has there been any further news? Feluda asked. Mahitosh Babu moved in his chair. A tiger doesn't become a man-eater just because a few people choose to call it so. I would have known if I'd been here and could have seen the body. However, the good news is that whatever animal attacked the poor boy has not yet shown further interest in human flesh. Feluda smiled. If indeed it was a man-eater, I'm sure you would have dropped your pen and picked up your gun, at least temporarily, he remarked. Oh yes. If a tiger went about eating men in my own area, most certainly I would consider it my duty to destroy it. We had finished our drinks. Mahitosh Babu said, You must be tired after your journey. Why don't you go to your room and have a little rest? I'll get someone in the evening to take you round in my jeep. A road goes through the forest. You may see deer or even elephants, if you're lucky. Torit, please show them the trophy room and then take them to their own. The trophy room turned out to be a hall stashed with the heads of tigers, bears, wild buffalo, and deer. Crocodile skins hung on a wall. There was hardly enough room for us all. I felt somewhat uncomfortable to find dozens of dead animals staring at me through their glassy eyes. But that wasn't all. The weapons that had been used to kill these animals were also displayed on a huge rack. None of us had ever seen so many guns. Single-barreled, double-barreled, guns to kill birds with, guns for tigers, and even some for elephants. There seemed to be no end to them. Have you ever been on a shikar? Feluda asked Torit Sengupta, looking at the various weapons. Mr. Sengupta laughed and shook his head. No, not me. You are a detective. Can't you tell by looking at me I have nothing to do with killing animals? One doesn't have to be physically very large and hefty to be a shikari. It's all to do with the steady nerve, isn't it? You do not strike me as someone who might lack it. No, my nerve is steady enough. But I come from an ordinary middle-class family in Calcutta. Shikar is something I've never even thought of. We left the trophy room and began climbing a staircase. "What is a man from a city doing in a place like this?" Feluda asked. "He is simply doing a job, Mr. Mitter. I couldn't find one in the city when I finished college. Then I saw the advertisement Mr. Roy had put in for a secretary. I applied, came here for an interview, and got it." "How long have you been here?" 5 years. "You like walking in the forest, don't you? I mean, even if you're not a shikari?" Mr. Sengupta looked at Feluda in surprise. "Why? What do you mean?" "There are scratch marks on your right hand. Ramble?" Mr. Sengupta smiled again. "Yes, you're right. You are remarkably observant, I must say. I got these marks only yesterday. Walking in the forest has become something like an addiction for me." "Even if you're unarmed?" "Yes. Normally there's nothing to be afraid of," Mr. Sengupta replied quietly. "The only things I have to watch out for are snakes and mad elephants." "And man-eaters?" Walmohan Babu whispered. "If a man-eater's existence is proved one day, I suppose I shall have to give up on my walks." There was a door at the top of the stairs, beyond which lay a long veranda. There were several rooms running down one side. The first of these was Mahitoj Babu's study. Mr. Sengupta worked in it during the day. The veranda curved to the left a little later, taking us to the west wing of the building. Our rooms were among the ones that lined this section of the veranda. "Are all these in use? Who stays in these rooms?" asked Feluda. "No one. Most of these stay locked. Mr. Roy and his brother live in the eastern side. Shashanka Sanyo and I are in the southern wing. 2 rooms in our side of the house are always kept ready for Mr. Roy's sons. He has 2 sons. Both work in Calcutta. They come here occasionally." Now I noticed another figure standing on the opposite veranda. A man wearing a purple dressing gown, leaning against the railing and staring straight at us. "Is that Mahitoj Babu's brother?" Feluda asked. Before Mr. Sengupta could reply, the man spoke. His voice was as deep as his brother's. "Have you seen Raju? Where is he?" The question was clearly meant for us. He moved closer quickly. There were visible resemblances between the 2 brothers, especially around the jaw. Mr. Sengupta answered on our behalf. "No, they haven't seen him." "No? What about Hussain? Have they seen Hussain?" His eyes were odd and focused. His hair was much thinner than his brother's and almost totally white. He might have been just as tall, but he stooped and so appeared shorter. "No, they haven't seen Hussain either," said Mr. Sengupta and motioned us to go inside our room. "They know nothing," he added firmly. "They're only visiting for a few days." Devtosh Babu looked openly disappointed. We slipped into our room quickly. "Who are Raju and Hussain?" Feluda wanted to know. Mr. Sengupta laughed. "Raju is another name for Kalapahar, and Hussain is Hussain Khan, who used to be the Sultan of Gaur. Both of them destroyed several Hindu temples in Bengal. The head of the statue in the temple of Jilpeshwar here was broken by Hussain Khan." "Were you a student of history?" "No, literature. But Mr. Roy is writing the history of his family. So, as a secretary, I'm having to pick up a few details here and there about past events in this area." Mr. Sengupta left. For the first time since our arrival, we were left by ourselves. I could now relax completely. The room was large and comfortable. There were 2 deer heads fixed over the door. Spread on the floor was a leopard skin, including the head. Perhaps it had not been possible to accommodate it anywhere else. There were 2 proper beds and a smaller wooden cot, which had clearly been added because there were 3 of us. All 3 beds had been carefully made, with thick mattresses, embroidered bed sheets, and pillowcases. Mosquito nets hung around each bed. Feluda looked at the cot and said, "This one was probably once used as a machan. Look, there are marks where it must have been tied with ropes. Topshe, you can sleep on it." Lalmohon Babu seemed quite satisfied with what he saw. He sat down on his bed and said, "I think we are going to enjoy the next 3 days. But I hope Devtosh Babu won't come back to ask about his friend Raju. Frankly speaking, I feel very uncomfortable in the presence of anyone mentally disturbed." The same thought had occurred to me, but Feluda did not appear concerned at all. He began unpacking, stopping only for a moment to frown and say, "We still don't know what kind of help Maitosh Babu is expecting from me." Chapter 3. Mr. Sengupta could not go with us in the evening as he had some important work to see to. Maitosh Babu's friend, Shashanka Sanyal, came with us instead. Having lived in these parts for many years, he too seemed to have learnt a lot about the local flora and fauna. He kept pointing out trees and plants to us, although it was quickly getting dark and not very easy to see from the back of the jeep. He had lived here for 30 years, he said. Before that, he was in Calcutta. Maitosh Babu and he had attended the same school and college. Our jeep stopped by the side of a small river. The sun was just about to set. "Let's get down for a while," Mr. Sanyal said. "You'll never get the feel, the real atmosphere in a forest from a moving jeep." I realized the minute we stepped out how dense and quiet the forest was. There was no noise except the gently rippling river and the birds going back to roost. Had there not been a man carrying a rifle, I would certainly have felt uneasy. This man was called Madhavlal. He was a professional shikari. When shikaris from abroad used to come here, it was always Madhavlal who used to act as their guide. Apparently, he knew everything about where a machan should be set up, where a tiger was likely to be spotted, what might mean if an animal cried out. He was about 50, tall and well-built, without even a trace of fat on his body. I was very glad he had been sent with us. We walked slowly over to the sandy bank and stood on the pebbles that were spread on the ground like a carpet. After chatting with Mr. Sanyal for a few minutes, Feluda suddenly asked, "What is the matter with Devtosh Babu? How did he happen to—" "Heredity. There is a history of madness in their family. Maitosh's grandfather went mad in his old age." "Really? Did he have to stop hunting?" "Oh, yes. Every firearm was removed out of sight. But one day, he found an old sword hanging on the wall in the drawing room. He grabbed it and went into the jungle to kill yet another tiger. Rumor has it that he wanted to do what Sher Shah had done. You must have been told in your history lessons in school how Sher Shah got his title. In his later years, he is said to have beheaded a tiger with one stroke of his sword, which earned him the title of Sher Shah. In a fit of madness, Aditya Narayan wanted to do the same." "And then?" Lalmohon Babu asked, his eyes round and his voice hushed. "He never returned. This time, the tiger won. There was virtually nothing left, except his sword." An animal called loudly from behind a bush. Ralmohan Babu nearly jumped out of his skin. Mr. Sanyal laughed. Mr. Ganguly, you're a writer of adventure stories. You shouldn't get frightened so easily. That was only a fox. Ralmohan Babu pulled himself together. You see, it is because I'm a writer that my imagination is livelier than others. We were talking about tigers, weren't we? And then I heard that animal, so I thought I could actually see a flash of yellow behind that bush. Well, something yellow and striped may well start moving behind bushes if we hang around, Mr. Sanyal remarked, suddenly lowering his voice. What? Was that a barking deer? Feluda whispered. A different animal had started to call. It sounded like the barking of a dog. Feluda had told me once that if a tiger was spotted close by, barking deer often called out to warn other animals. Mr. Sanyal nodded in silence and motioned us to get back into the jeep. We crept back and took our places in absolute silence. It was now appreciably darker. My heart started thumping loudly. Madhavlal too had moved closer to the jeep, clutching his rifle tightly. Ralmohan Babu touched my hand briefly. His palm felt icy. We waited in breathless anticipation until 6 o'clock, but no animal came into view. We had to return disappointed. It was totally dark by the time we reached our room. To our surprise, we realized that in this short time, large thick clouds had gathered in the western sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning spread its roots everywhere in the sky, dazzling our eyes. We were all staring out of the window, watching the spectacle, when someone knocked at the door. It had been left open. We turned around to find Maithosh Sinha Roy standing there. "How was your trip to the forest?" he asked in his deep voice. "We almost saw a tiger," Ralmohan Babu shouted, excited like a child. "If you had come here even 10 years ago, you would certainly have seen one," said our host. "If you failed to see one today, I must admit I and other shikaris like me are to blame, for shikar was considered to be a sport. Even in ancient times, kings used to go on hunting expeditions which they called mrigaya. So did Mughal Badshahs, and in modern times, our British masters. It became a tradition which we followed blindly. Can you imagine how many animals have been killed in these 2,000 years? But that isn't all, is it? Just think of the number of animals that are caught every year for zoos and circuses." None of us knew what to say. Was the famous shikari now sorry for what he had done? Feluda offered him a chair, but he declined. "No, thank you," he said. "I didn't come here to stay. I came only to show you something. Let's go to my grandfather's room. I think you'll find it interesting." Aditya Narayan's room was in the northern wing. "We heard how he had lost his mind in his old age," Feluda said, as we began moving in that direction. Maithosh Babu smiled. "Yes, but until that happened, till he was about 60, there were few men with his intelligence and sharpness." "Do you still have the sword he had taken to kill a tiger?" "Yes, it's kept in his room. Come, I'll show you." Bookshelves occupied 3 sides of Aditya Narayan's room. Each of them was packed with books, papers, manuscripts, and stacks of old newspapers. The 4th side had 2 chests and a glass case. It is impossible to make a list of its contents that ranged from tiger's nails and a rhino's horn to metal statues and jewelry from Bhutan. The collar that his favorite dog had worn was also there. It was studded with stones, like all the Bhutanese jewelry. Apart from these, there was a silver pen and inkwell, binoculars from Mughal times, and 2 human skulls. All these things occupied the top 2 shelves. The bottom 2 contained only weapons: a 300-year-old carved pistol, 8 daggers and kukris, and a famous sword. Only a madman could think it would be enough to kill a tiger, for it was neither very big nor heavy. The swords I had seen in Bikaner fort that had once belonged to Rajput rulers were much more impressive. While we were examining these objects, Maitosh Babu had opened one of the chests and brought out a small ivory box. Now he took out a folded piece of paper from it and said, "Detectives, I believe, have a special gift to unravel puzzles and riddles. See what you make out of this one, Mr. Mitter." A riddle? I was once interested in things of that sort, but... Maitosh Babu passed the piece of paper to Feluda. "You said you wanted to spend 3 days here. If you cannot figure it out in that time, I'm prepared to give you another 3 days, but no more after that." His tone changed as he spoke the last few words, as did the look in his eyes. I realized with a shock that our genial host had a streak of cold sternness, perhaps even ruthlessness, in him. Obviously, there were times when the side to his character was exposed. Feluda asked quickly, even before Maitosh Babu's eyes could lose their cold, remote look, "And what if I succeed?" His own tone was light, and there was a hint of a smile round his lips. But it was clear that Feluda didn't lack the ability to deal with Maitosh Babu, no matter how stern he might be. Maitosh Roy laughed, his good humour restored. "If you succeed, Mr. Mitter, I will give you a whole tiger skin, taken from one of the biggest tigers I have killed." This was quite generous, I had to admit. The value of a whole tiger skin today was not to be laughed at. Feluda now looked at the piece of paper and read aloud the riddle. "Old man hollow, pace to follow, people's tree. 10:30, half again, century. Rising sun, whence it's done, can't you see? Between hands, below them stands, yours it be." "Hidden treasure," Feluda murmured. "You think so?" "Yes, that's what the last line seems to indicate. I mean, yours it be could only mean finding something after solving that riddle and being rewarded for it. It has to be money. But what we must consider is whether your grandfather was the kind of man who would hide his wealth and then leave a coded message for its recovery. Not many people would think of doing such a thing." "My grandfather would. He was very different from ordinary men. I have told you that. He loved practical jokes and having a laugh at the expense of others. When he was a child, I believe one day he was cross with all the grown-ups for some reason, so he stole their shoes in the middle of the night and hung them in bundles from the highest branch of a tree. Yes, I can well believe. What is it, Torit?" None of us had noticed Torit Sengupta come into the room. He was standing near the door. "I came to return a dictionary I had taken from that shelf," he replied quietly. "Very well, put it back. And have you finished with those proofs?" "Yes, sir." "Then you must take them with you tomorrow, and ask them why there were so many errors even in the second proof. Don't let them get away with it." Mr. Sengupta slipped the book he was carrying into an empty space on a shelf and left. "Torit is going to Calcutta tomorrow for a week. His mother is ill," Maitosh Babu explained. Feluda was still staring at the wine. "Who else knows about this riddle?" he asked. Maitosh Babu switched the light off and began moving towards the door. We found it only 10 days ago. I was going through old papers and correspondence as I want to start writing the history of our family. Many of my grandfather's personal papers were found in an old steel trunk. That ivory box was hidden under a pile of letters. Only 3 people know about it: Shashanka, Torit, and myself. But none of us have the required skill to decipher the message. One needs to know about words. One single word can have different meanings, can't it? Do you think you can crack it, Mr. Mitter? Feluda returned the piece of paper to Maitosh Babu. What? Are you giving up already? He cried in dismay. No, Feluda smiled. I can remember all the words. I'll go and write them down in my notebook. That paper belongs to you and your family. It should stay with you. Chapter 4. You will get a tiger skin, Felubabu. But what about me? Lalmohon Babu asked, sounding disappointed. We had finished dinner an hour ago. Our host had regaled us after dinner with exciting stories about his experiences in the wild. We had only just wished him a good night and returned from the drawing room. Why do you say that, Lalmohon Babu? Whoever solves this code will get that skin. At least, he should. So why don't you give it a go yourself? You're a writer. You have a good command over your language. And you have imagination. So come on. Pooh! My command over language would never get me through all that hollow follow and handstands and what you have. You are the one who is going to get the reward. Do you think he might give you this one? He looked at the skin that lay sprawling on the floor. No, I don't think so. Didn't he mention a big tiger? I have no interest in leopards. Feluda had already written down the few lines that made up the puzzle and was now staring at his notebook. Is it making any sense at all? Lalmohon Babu persisted. No, not really, except that I'm positive it involves hidden treasure, Feluda replied without looking up. How can you tell? What's all that about following a hollow old man? I don't know yet, but I think the word follow is important, and so is pace. Perhaps it's simply telling you where you should go. Take paces to something, or from something. Nothing else is clear. So we must... Feluda couldn't finish speaking. Someone had walked in through the open door. It was Devtosh Babu. He was still wearing the same purple dressing gown. His eyes held the same wild look, as though he suspected everyone he met of having committed a crime. He looked straight at Lalmohon Babu and said, Did the boat Raja send you? Boat? Lalmohon Babu gulped. Do you mean vote? Elections? No, I think he's talking of the Raja of Bhutan, Feluda said softly. Devtosh Babu turned his eyes immediately on Feluda, thereby releasing Lalmohon Babu from an extremely awkward situation. Are the boats coming back? He wanted to know. No, I don't think so, Feluda replied, his voice absolutely normal. But it is possible now to travel to Bhutan quite easily. Really? Devtosh Babu sounded as though this was the first time he had heard the news. Good, he said. That's good. They had once been very helpful. It was only because of them that the soldiers of the Nawab couldn't do anything. They know how to fight. But not everyone knows that, do they? He sighed deeply, then added, Not everyone can handle weapons. No, not everyone can be like Aditya Narayan. He turned abruptly and began walking to the door. Then he stopped, turned back, looked at the leopard skin on the floor and said something perfectly weird. "Do you know about the wheels of Yudhishthir's chariot? They never touch the ground. Yet, in the end, they did. They had to." Then he quickly left the room. We sat in silence after he had gone. After a few minutes, I heard Feluda mutter. He was wearing clogs. The soles were lined with rubber to muffle the noise. Our first night turned out to be quite eventful. I shall try to describe what happened in the right order. A grandfather clock on the top of the stairs helped me to keep track of time. The first thing we realized within 10 minutes of going to bed was that although we had been given thick mattresses and beautiful linen, no one had thought of checking the mosquito nets. There were holes in all three, which simply meant an open invitation to all the mosquitoes in the region. Thank goodness Feluda always carried a tube of Odomos with him. Each of us had to use it before going back to bed. When I did, suitably embalmed, I could hear the clock outside strike 11. The clouds had dispersed to make way for the moon. I could see a patch of moonlight on the floor and was looking at it, when suddenly someone spoke on the veranda. "I'm warning you for the last time. This is not going to do you any good." It was Satyajit Roy. He sounded furious. There was no reply from the other person. On my right, Lalmohan Babu had started to snore. I turned to my left and whispered, "Feluda, did you hear that?" "Yes," Feluda whispered back. "Go to sleep." I said nothing more. I must have fallen asleep almost immediately, but woke again a little later. The moon was still there, but the thunder was back, rolling in the distance. I lay quietly listening to it, but as the last rumble died away, it was replaced by another noise. Kut-kut, kut-kut, kut-kut. It did not continue at a regular pace, but stopped abruptly. Then it started again. Now it became clear that it was coming from inside our room. It got drowned occasionally by the thunder outside, but it did not stay silent for long. I could hear Feluda breathing deeply and regularly. He was obviously fast asleep. But why had Lalmohan Babu stopped snoring? I glanced at his bed, but could see nothing through the nets. Then I became aware of another noise, a faint chattering noise, which I recognized instantly. A few years ago, during a visit to Shimla, Lalmohan Babu had slipped and fallen on the snow as a bullet came and hit the ground near his feet. He had made the same noise then. It was simply the sound of his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Kut-kut, kut-kut, kut. There it was again. I raised my head to look at the floor. The mosquito net rustled with the slight movement, which told Lalmohan Babu that I was awake. "Tapesh!" he cried in a strange, hoarse voice. "The leopard!" I sat up to look properly at the leopard skin. What I saw froze my blood. Moonlight was still streaming in through a window to shine directly on the head of the leopard. It was rising and turning every now and then, first to the left and then to the right, making that strange noise. "Feluda!" I called, unable to stop myself. I knew Feluda would wake instantly and be totally alert, no matter how deeply he had been sleeping. "What is it? Why are you shouting?" he asked. I tried to tell him, but discovered that, like Lalmohan Babu, my throat had gone completely dry. All I could manage was, "Look! Floor!" Feluda climbed out of his bed and stood staring at the moving head of the leopard. Then he stepped forward coolly and placed a finger under its chin, tilting it up. A large beetle crawled out. With unruffled calm, he picked it up and threw it out of the window. "Didn't you know about the demonic strength of a beetle? If you place a heavy brass bowl over it, it will drag it about all over the house," Feluda said. I could feel myself go limp with relief. From the way Lal Mohan Babu sighed, I could tell he was feeling the same. But why was Feluda still standing at the window? What was there to see in the dead of night? "Topshe, come and have a look," he invited. Lal Mohan Babu and I joined him. Our room, which was in the rear portion of the house, overlooked the Kalbuni forest. In the last couple of minutes, thick clouds had once again obliterated the moon. There was lightning, and the sound of thunder appeared closer. But what surprised me was that, in addition to the lightning, another light flashed in the distance. It kept moving about among the trees in the forest. Someone with a torch was out there. There was no doubt about that. "Highly suspicious," Lal Mohan Babu muttered. Then the torch was switched off. In the same instant, there was a blinding flash, followed by an ear-splitting noise. Almost immediately, it began to pour in great torrents. We had to pull the shutters down quickly. "It's past 1 o'clock, Feluda said. "Let's try and get some sleep. We are supposed to go to the temple of Jalpeshwar in the morning, remember?" The three of us got back into bed, behind the mosquito nets. I stared at the windows. Although they were shut, their multicolored panes shone brightly each time there was a flash of lightning, flooding the room with all the hues of a rainbow. I couldn't tell when this colorful display stopped, and when I fell asleep. Chapter 5. The next morning, I woke at 7 o'clock. Feluda was already up and had finished doing his yoga, bathing and shaving. Mr. Sengupta was supposed to collect us at 8 and take us to the temple. One of the three bearers, called Kanai, brought us our morning tea at 7:30. Feluda picked up his cup, then went back to staring at the notebook lying open in his lap. "Bravo, Adityanarayan," I heard him murmur. "What a brain you had." Lal Mohan Babu slurped his tea noisily and said, "Very good tea, I must say. Why, Felu Babu, have you made any progress?" Feluda continued to mutter. 10:30. That's 5. Half again. Century. Century would mean 100, so half of that is 50. 5 and 50, that's 55. Okay, he probably means 55 paces. But what does it relate to? The tree? What is a people's tree? I must think. My heart lifted suddenly. He had started to solve the riddle. I felt sure he'd be able to get the entire meaning before he left, with the tiger skin, of course. The clock outside struck 8. Mr. Sengupta should be here soon, I thought. A few minutes passed, but there was no sign of him. Feluda didn't seem to be aware of the delay. He was still engrossed in the puzzle. "Rising sun," I heard him say. Could it mean the east? Yes. 55 paces to the east of something. What can it mean? The tree. Someone knocked on the door. It was Shashank Sanyal, not Mr. Sengupta. "Haven't you finished your tea?" "Oh, I'm sorry," he said. Feluda put his notebook away and got to his feet. Mr. Sanyal was looking visibly upset. "What is it? What's the matter?" Feluda asked quickly. Mr. Sanyal cleared his throat, then spoke somewhat absently. "There's some bad news, Mr. Mitter. Torit Sengupta, Maitoshu's secretary, died last night." "What? How?" Feluda asked. Lalmohan Babu and I simply stared speechlessly. "It seems he went into the forest last night. No one knows why. His body was found only a little while ago by a woodcutter." "But how did he die? What happened?" "Apparently, his body has been partially eaten by some animal, quite possibly a tiger." "The man-eater!" My hands suddenly felt cold and clammy. Lalmohan Babu had been standing in the middle of the room. He now took 3 steps backwards to grab the corner of a table and lean against it. Feluda stood still, looking extremely grim. "I'm sorry," Mr. Sanyal said again. "You only came yesterday for a holiday, and now this has happened. I'm afraid we are going to be rather busy. I mean, we have to go and see the body for ourselves, naturally." "Can we go with you?" At this question, Mr. Sanyal glanced swiftly at us and said, "You may be used to gory deaths, Mr. Mitter, but the others? They will stay in the jeep. I will not let them see anything unpleasant." Mr. Sanyal agreed. "Very well. We have 2 jeeps. You 3 can travel in one." "Are we going to carry a gun?" This question came from Lalmohan Babu. At any other time, Mr. Sanyal would have laughed at the idea. But now he said seriously, "Yes, there is nothing to be afraid of during the day, but we are going to be armed." None of us spoke in the jeep. I hadn't yet got over the shock. Only last evening he was alive. He had spoken with us. And now he was dead, killed by a man-eater. What was he doing in the forest in the middle of the night? The light we saw moving among the trees, was it coming from Mr. Sengupta's torch? There was another jeep in front of ours. In it were Maitosh Babu, Mr. Sanyal, a man called Mr. Datta from the forest department, the shikari Madhavlal, and the woodcutter who had found the body and come running to the house. Maitosh Babu, who had told us so many exciting stories only the previous night, seemed to have aged considerably in the last couple of hours. What I couldn't figure out was whether it was because of the tragic death of a secretary or because of the implications of having a man-eater running loose in the area. We did not have to go very far into the forest. Only 5 minutes after taking the road that ran through the forest, the jeep in front of us slowed down and then stopped. The road was lined with large trees. I recognized teak, silk cotton, and neem. There was a huge jackfruit tree and a number of bamboo groves. Evidence of last night's rain lay everywhere. Every little hole and hollow in the ground was full of water. "Look," Feluda said as our jeep stopped. I looked in the direction he pointed and noticed, after a few seconds, a light green object on a bush. It was a torn piece of the shirt Mr. Sengupta had worn the night before. I had no problem in recognizing it. Our jeep stood at least 50 yards away from where Mr. Sengupta's body lay, hidden out of sight, thankfully. Everyone from the other jeep climbed out. The woodcutter began walking. Feluda too got out and said, "You 2 wait here. It must be a horrible sight." The others disappeared behind a bamboo grove. Although we were at some distance from them, I could hear what they said, possibly because the forest was totally silent. The first person to speak was Maitosh Babu. "My God!" he exclaimed, slapping his forehead with his palm. "It's useless now to look for pug marks. The rain would have washed them away. But it does look like an attack by a tiger, doesn't it?" asked Mr. Dutta. "Yes, undoubtedly," Maitosh Babu replied. "It stopped raining after 2 o'clock last night. From the way the blood has been washed away, it seems he was killed before it started to rain." Feluda spoke next. "But does a man-eater always start eating its prey on the same spot where it kills it? Doesn't it often carry its dead prey from one place to another?" "Yes, that's true," Maitosh Babu replied. "But don't think we can find traces of the body being dragged on the ground. No mark would have stayed for very long in all that rain. In any case, a tiger is quite capable of carrying the body of a man in such a way that it wouldn't touch the ground at all. So I don't think we'll ever find out where exactly Torrid was attacked. If we could find his glasses, maybe that would—" Feluda's voice trailed away. This was followed by a few minutes' silence. Through the leaves, I saw Mr. Sanyal move. Perhaps he was trying to look for pug marks. "Madhavlal?" called Maitosh Babu, but could get no further, for Feluda interrupted him. "Can a tiger use just one single nail to leave a deep wound?" he asked. "Why? What makes you say that?" "Perhaps you didn't notice. There's a wound on his chest. Something narrow and very sharp pierced through his clothes and went into his body. If you come this way, sir, I'll show you what I mean." Everyone gathered round the body once more. Then I heard Maitosh Babu cry, "Oh God! Dear God in heaven! This is murder! That kind of injury couldn't possibly have been caused by an animal. Someone killed him before the tiger and found him. Oh, what a terrible disaster!" "Murder, or it may be attempted murder," Feluda spoke slowly. "He was stabbed, that much is clear. But maybe his assassin left him injured and ran away. When the tiger came along, an injured prey must have made his job that much easier. If only we could find the weapon." "Shashanka, please inform the police at once," Maitosh Babu said. Everyone then returned to the jeep, leaving only Madhavlal with his gun to guard the body. When Feluda joined us, I was shocked to see how grim he looked. He didn't speak another word on the way back. Neither were we in the mood to talk. We passed a herd of deer a few moments later, but even that did not bring me any joy. We had faced danger many times in the past, and had had to deal with unforeseen complexities, but this seemed utterly bizarre. Not only was there a mysterious death, a possible murderer to be found and arrested, but to top it all, a man-eater. I stole a glance at Lalmohan Babu. Never before had I seen him look so ashen. Chapter 6. We were back in our room. It was now 5 p.m. Shashanka Sanyal had informed the police, who had started their investigation. At this moment, there was really nothing to do for us. We had just had tea. Despite all my mental turmoil, I couldn't help noticing just how good the tea was. It was from Maitosh Babu's own estate, we were told. Feluda was pacing, frowning and cracking his knuckles, stopping occasionally to light a charminar, then stuffing it into a brass ashtray after just a couple of puffs. I sat staring out of the window. The sky today was quite clear. Lalmon Babu kept lifting up the head of the leopard on our floor and inspecting its teeth. I saw him do this at least 3 times. If only I had had the chance to get to know him better, Feluda muttered. This was truly unfortunate. Mr. Sengupta had died before we could learn anything about him. How could Feluda get anywhere unless he knew what kind of a man he had been, who would want to kill him, whether he had had any enemies? A few minutes after the clock on the veranda struck 5, a servant came up to inform us that Maitosh Babu wanted to see us. We rose at once and went to the drawing room. Besides our host and Mr. Sanyal, there was a third man in the room, wearing a police uniform. This is Inspector Biswas, Maitosh Babu said. When I told him you were the first one to suspect murder, he said he'd like to meet you. Namaskar, said Feluda and took a chair opposite the inspector. We found a settee for ourselves. Mr. Biswas was very dark and quite bald, although he could not have been more than 40. He sported a thin moustache, one side of which was longer than the other. Perhaps he hadn't been paying attention while trimming it. He cast a sharp glance at Feluda and said, I believe you're an amateur detective? Feluda smiled and nodded. Do you know the difference between your lot and mine? There's usually a murder when you visit a place. We visit a place after there's been a murder. Mr. Biswas laughed loudly at his own joke. Feluda went straight to the point. Has the murder weapon been found? Mr. Biswas stopped laughing and shook his head. No, but we're still looking for it. You can imagine how difficult it is to find something in a forest, especially when there is a man-eater lurking in it. Even the police are men, aren't they? I mean, which man wants to get eaten? Feluda forced a smile since the inspector was laughing so much, but grew serious immediately. Is it true that he died because he was stabbed? He asked. That's impossible to tell from what's left of the body. The tiger finished nearly half of it. There will be a post-mortem, naturally, but I don't think that's going to be of any use. There is no doubt that he was stabbed. We have to catch whoever did it. Now, whether he died as a result of stabbing, or whether it was because of the tiger's attack, we do not know. In any case, what the tiger did is not our concern. That's for Mr. Roy to sort out. Maitosh Babu was staring at the carpet. Already, he said grimly, there is pretty widespread panic among the villagers. Some of my own men who work as woodcutters come from local villages. They have to work for another couple of months, after which the monsoon will start, so their work will have to stop. But they're not willing to risk their lives right now. I simply do not know what to do. Before I do anything at all, I must learn who killed Torrit. Why did he have to die? If I cannot hunt the tiger down, the forest department must find someone. After all, I'm not the only shikari in this area. Mr. Biswas cleared his throat. There is only one question in my mind, he said. Why did your secretary go to the forest in the middle of the night? The motive for killing, I think, is relatively simple. We didn't find a wallet or any money or any other valuables on his person. So whoever killed him simply wanted those, I think. Plain robbery. There's your motive. If that was the case, Feluda said quietly, lighting a cigarette, he could simply have been knocked unconscious with a rod, or even a heavy walking stick. He did not have to be killed. Mr. Biswas laughed again, a little dryly this time. No, he said. But if you rule out robbery, can you think of a suitable motive, Mr. Mitter? Taurid Sengupta worked for Mr. Sinha Roy. His world consisted of books and papers. He arrived here 5 years ago, didn't go out much, and didn't know anyone except those in this house. Who would wish to kill a man like that, unless he, or they, came upon him by chance and decided to rob him of what possessions he had? Feluda frowned in silence. Yes, I know an amateur detective wouldn't appreciate the idea of a simple robbery, Mr. Biswas mocked. You like complications, don't you? You like mysteries. Well then, here's a first-class mystery for you, Mr. Mitter. Why did Mr. Sengupta go into the forest in the first place? What was he doing there? Try and solve that one. No one made a reply. Mr. Sanyal was sitting next to his friend in absolute silence. Maitosh Babu was still looking pale and exhausted. He kept shaking his head and muttering under his breath, I don't understand. Nothing makes sense. There didn't seem to be anything else to say. We rose a minute later. To my surprise, Mr. Biswas spoke quite kindly before we left. You may carry on with your own investigation, Mr. Mitter, he said. We don't mind that in the least. After all, you were the first person to notice the stab wound. We left the drawing-room, but did not return to our own. Feluda went out of the front door, through the portico, and turned right to go behind the house, past the old stables, and possibly where elephants used to be kept. I glanced up at once. We were at the back of the house, and saw a row of windows on the first floor. Some were shut, others open. Through one of the open windows, I could see Lal Mohan Babu's towel hanging on his bedpost. Had it not been there, it would have been impossible to identify our own room. There was a door on the ground floor, directly below our window. Perhaps this acted as the back door. Mr. Sengupta might have slipped out of it to go to the forest last night. About 50 yards away, there was a tiny hut with a thatched roof. A group of men were huddled before it. I recognized one of them. It was Maitosh Babu's chowkidar. Perhaps the hut belonged to him. Feluda strode forward in that direction, closely followed by Lal Mohan Babu and me. The forest Kalbuni stretched in the background, behind which lay a range of bluish-grey mountains. The chowkidar gave us a salute as we got closer. "What is your name?" Feluda asked him. "Chandan Mishir, Huzur." He was an old man, with close-cropped hair and wrinkles round his eyes. From the way he spoke, it was obvious that he chewed tobacco. Feluda started chatting with him. From what he told us, it appeared that the local people were far more worried about the man-eater than about Mr. Sengupta's death. Chandan, who had spent 50 years working for the Sinha Roys, had seen or heard of mad elephants in the jungle which came out at times, but there hadn't been a man-eater for at least 30 years. It was Chandan's belief that the tiger had been injured by a poacher, which now hampered its ability to find prey in the forest. This could well be true. Or maybe the tiger was old. Sometimes tigers became man-eaters when their teeth became worn and weak. I have even read that trying to eat a porcupine might injure a tiger to such an extent that it would then be forced to kill humans, which is easier than hunting other animals in the wild. "Do the locals want Maitosh Babu to kill this tiger?" Feluda asked. Chandan scratched his head. "Yes, of course. But our Babu has never been on a shikar in these parts. He has been to the jungles in Assam and Orissa, but not here, he said. This came as a big surprise to us all. Why? Why hasn't he ever hunted here? Babu's grandfather and father were both killed by tigers, you see. So Maitosh Babu went away from here. We had no idea that his father had also been killed by a tiger. Chandan told us what had happened. Apparently, Maitosh Babu's father had shot a tiger from a machan. The tiger fell and lay so still that everyone thought it had died. 10 minutes later, when he climbed down from the machan and went closer to the tiger, it sprang up and attacked him viciously. Although he was taken to a hospital, his wounds turned septic and he died in a few days. Feluda stood frowning when Chandan finished his tale. Then he pointed at the hut and said, "Is that where you live?" "Gee, Huzur." "When do you go to sleep?" Chandan looked profoundly startled by this question. Feluda stopped beating about the bush. "The man who was killed last night—" "Torid Babu?" "Yes. He left the house quite late at night and went into the forest. Did you see him go?" "No, not last night. But I saw him go in there the day before yesterday and a few days before that. He went there more than once, often in the evening. Last night—" "Yes? I saw not Torid Babu, but someone else." The expression on Feluda's face changed instantly. "Who did you see?" he asked urgently. "I don't know, Huzur. The torch Torid Babu used to carry was a large one, an old one with 3 cells. This man had a smaller torch, but its light was just as strong." "Is that all you saw? Just the light from a torch? Nothing else?" "No, Huzur. I didn't see who it was." Feluda started to ask something else, but had to stop. One of the servants from the house was running towards us. "Please come back to the house, sir," he called. "Babu wants to see you at once." We quickly went back to the front of the house. Maitosh Babu was waiting for us near the portico. "You were right," he said as soon as we saw Feluda. "Torid was not killed by a passing hooligan in the forest." "How can you be so sure?" "The murder weapon was taken from our house. Remember the sword I showed you yesterday? It is missing from my grandfather's room." Chapter 7. It was the servant called Kanai who had first noticed that the sword was missing when he went in to dust the room. He informed his master immediately. The room was not locked, since it contained several books and papers which Maitosh Babu frequently needed to refer to. All the servants were old and trusted. Nothing had been stolen from the house for so many years that people had stopped worrying about theft altogether. What it meant was that anyone in the house could have taken the sword. Feluda examined the glass case carefully, but did not find a clue. It was just the sword that was missing. Everything else was in place. "I'd like to see Mr. Sengupta's bedroom and the study where he worked," Feluda said when he had finished. "But before I do that, I need to know if you suspect anyone." Maitosh Babu shook his head. "No, I simply cannot imagine why anyone should want to kill him. He hardly ever saw anyone outside this house. All he did was go on long walks. If that sword was used to kill him, then it has to be someone from this house who did it. No, Mr. Mitter, I cannot help you at all." We made our way to Mr. Sengupta's bedroom. It was as large as ours. Among his personal effects were his clothes, a blue suitcase, a shoulder bag, and a shaving kit. On the table were a few magazines and books, a writing pad, and a couple of pencils. A smaller bedside table held a flask, a glass, a transistor radio, and a packet of cigarettes. The suitcase wasn't locked. Feluda opened it to find that it was very neatly packed. He was obviously all set to leave for Calcutta, he remarked, closing it again. 5 minutes later, we came out of the bedroom and went into his study. What exactly did his duties involve? Feluda asked Maitosh Babu. Well, he handled all my correspondence. Then he made copies of my manuscripts, since my own handwriting is really quite bad. He used to go to Calcutta and speak to my publishers on my behalf and correct the proofs. Of late, he had been helping me gather information about my ancestors to write a history of my family. This meant having to go through heaps of old letters and documents and making a note of relevant details. Did he use these notebooks to record all the information? Feluda asked, pointing at the thick, bound notebooks neatly arranged on a desk. Maitosh Babu nodded. And are these the proofs for your new book he was correcting? Stacks of printed sheets were kept on the desk, next to the notebooks. Feluda picked up a few sheets and began leafing through them. Tell me, was Mr. Sengupta a very reliable proofreader? Maitosh Babu looked quite taken aback by the question. Yes, I think so. Why do you ask? Look, there's a mistake in the first paragraph of the first page, which he overlooked. The A in the word roar is missing. And again, look, the second E in deer hasn't been printed, but he didn't spot it. How strange! Maitosh Babu glanced absently at the mistakes Feluda pointed out. Had he seemed worried about something recently? Did he have anything on his mind? Why, no, I hadn't noticed anything. Feluda bent over the desk and peered at a writing pad on which Mr. Sengupta had doodled and drawn little pictures. Did you know he could draw? No, he had never told me. There was nothing else to say. We stepped out of the room and reached the veranda outside. A deep, familiar voice reached our ears, speaking in a somewhat theatrical fashion. Doomed, doomed, destruction and calamity. The very foundation of truth is being rocked. The end is nigh. We only heard his voice. Devtosh Babu remained out of sight. His brother sighed and said, Every summer he gets a little worse. He'll be all right once the rains start and it cools down. We had reached our room. Feluda said, I was thinking of going back to the forest tomorrow. I need to search, find things for myself. What do you say? Maitosh Babu thought for a moment. Then he said, Well, I don't think the tiger will return to the spot where Torrid's body was found. At least, not during the day. That's what my experience with tigers tells me. Anyway, so if you stay relatively close to that area, you're going to be safe. To tell you the truth, what I find most surprising is that a large tiger is still left in Kalbuni. May we take Madhavlal with us and a jeep? Certainly. Maitosh Babu left. The police had to be informed about the missing sword. It was now quite dark outside, although the sky was absolutely clear. Walmohan Babu switched the fan on and sat down on his bed. Did you think you'd get a murder mystery on a short holiday? It's a bonus, isn't it, Fellow Babu? You have to thank me for it. He laughed. Sure, Lalmohan Babu. I'm most thankful, Feluda replied, sounding a little preoccupied. He had picked up 2 things from Torit Sengupta's room and brought them back with him. One was a book on the history of Cooch Behar, and the other was the writing pad. I saw him staring at the little pictures, frowning deeply. These are not just funny doodles, he said, almost to himself. I'm sure it has a meaning. What could it be? Why do I feel there's something familiar about these pictures? Lalmohan Babu and I went and stood next to him. Mr. Sengupta had drawn a tree on the pad, a tree with a solid trunk and several leafy branches. A few leaves were lying loose at the bottom of the tree. Their base was broad, but they tapered off to end on a thin, narrow point. I had no problem in recognizing them. They were peepal leaves. But that was not all. He had drawn footprints going away from the tree towards what looked like a couple of hands I peered more closely. Yes, there were 2 hands, or rather, 2 open palms. He had even drawn tiny lines on them, just as they appear on human hands. Behind these was a sun, not a full round one, but one that had only half risen. Between the 2 hands was a tiny cross. Something began stirring in my own mind. This picture was meant to convey a message. Was it a message that perhaps I had heard before? Where? I began to feel quite confused. Feluda cleared all confusion in less than a minute. Yes, 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 he exclaimed softly. Of course. Well done, Mr. Sengupta, well done. Then he caught me looking expectantly at him. Do you see what this is, Topshe? It's a picture of the puzzle. Torit Sengupta had cracked it, possibly quite soon after they found it among Aditya Narayan's papers. Let's have a look. He opened his notebook. Old Man Hollow. Now that's the only bit that's not clear. But pace to follow means 55 paces. Those are the footprints, going from the peepal's tree, which is simply a peepal tree. Aditya Narayan called it a peepal's tree either because it sounded familiar to people or because it was for some reason important to people. That rising sun, as I had guessed myself, means the east. So 55 paces to the east of a peepal tree are 2 hands? Lalmohan Babu asked hopefully. Yes and no. Look at the picture. They are palms. So there must be 2 palms, palm trees, near the peepal. And if you dig the ground between these palms, you'll probably find the treasure. It makes no sense to me, Lalmohan Babu complained. Tell me what the whole message is. But I just did. In the forest somewhere, there is a peepal tree. 55 paces, that would be about 55 yards, to the east of this tree are 2 palms. And... Okay, between those palms, below them stands... So you mean below the ground is the buried treasure? Whatever that might be? I get it now. But, Fellow Babu, there may be dozens of peepal trees in that forest and scores of palms, all within 50 yards of one another. How many will you look for? Feluda was silent, still frowning. Yes, he said at last. The first line, Old Man Hollow is probably an indicator. I mean, that's what actually identifies the tree and tells you which particular peepal tree to look for. But what can it mean? Even this picture doesn't tell us anything, does it? The old man... He had to stop. Who was talking of old men? Asked Devtosh Babu, lifting the curtain and walking into the room. He was still wearing the same purple dressing gown. Didn't he have anything else to wear? Oh, please do come in, sir. Have a seat. Feluda invited. Devtosh Babu paid no attention to him. Do you know why Yudhishthir's chariot got stuck to the ground? He asked. He had said this before. Why was he obsessed with Yudhishthir's chariot? No. Why? Feluda answered calmly. Because he had told a lie. He had to be punished. One single lie, and it can finish you. Devtosh Babu, Feluda said conversationally. May I ask you something? He looked perfectly amazed. Ask me something? Why? No one ever asks me anything. I'd like to, because I know about your knowledge of local history. Can you tell me if there's a tree associated with an old man? I mean, you're in the forest? Did an old man sit under a tree? It was a shot in the dark, but it made Devtosh Babu's sad and intense face suddenly break into a smile. It transformed his whole appearance. No old man actually sat under the tree. It was in the tree itself. What? Was he talking nonsense again? But his eyes and his voice seemed perfectly normal. There was a hollow in the tree trunk, he explained quickly, that looked like the face of an old man. You think I'm mad, don't you? But I swear that hollow looked exactly as though an old man was gaping with his mouth open. We loved that tree. Grandfather used to call it the tree of the toothless fakir. He used to take us there for picnics. What kind of a tree was it? A peepal. Have you seen the temple of the chopped goddess? That was Raju's doing. This tree was behind the temple. In fact, it was from the same tree that Mahi... Dada! Come back here at once! Shouted a voice outside the door. Devtosh Babu broke off, for his brother had appeared at the door, looking and sounding extremely cross. Devtosh Babu stepped into the room. His face was set, his eyes cold. Did you take your pills? He asked sternly. What pills? I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. Why should I have to take pills? Without another word, Devtosh Babu dragged his brother out of our room. We could hear him scolding him as they moved away. Let the doctor decide how you are. You will kindly continue to take the pills you have been prescribed. Is that understood? Their footsteps died away. Pity, Lal Mohan Babu remarked. He seemed quite normal today, didn't he? Feluda did not appear to have heard him. He was looking preoccupied again. The tree of the toothless fakir, he said under his breath. Well, that takes care of both the old man and the hollow. All we need to do now, friends, is find the temple of the chopped goddess. Chapter 8. Feluda did not go to bed until late that night. Lal Mohan Babu and I stayed up with him until 11, talking about Torik's and Gupta's death. None of us could figure out why a young and obviously intelligent man like him had to die such an awful and mysterious death. Even Feluda could not find answers to a lot of questions. He made a list of these. 1. Who, apart from Mr. Sengupta, had gone to the forest that night? Was it the murderer? Was it the person who had stolen the sword? Or was it a third person? Who could have a small but powerful torch? 2. We had all heard Major Sinha Roy having an argument with someone the same night. Who was he speaking to? 3. Devtoj Babu was about to tell us something concerning the peepal tree and his brother when the latter interrupted him. What was he going to say? 4. Why did Devtoj Babu mention Yudhishthir's chariot more than once? Was it simply the raving of a madman, or did it have any significance? 5. Why does Shashanka Sanya speak so little? Was he quiet and reserved by nature, or was there a specific reason behind his silence? Lalmohan Babu heard him read out this list, then said, Look, fellow Babu, there's one man who continues to make me feel uneasy. Yes, I am talking of Devtoj Babu. He spoke quite normally a few hours ago, but at other times he isn't normal, is he? What if he came upon someone accidentally in the forest and decided it was Kalapahar, or Raju as he calls him? He might attack this person, mightn't he? Feluda stared at Lalmohan Babu for a few seconds before speaking. Working with me has clearly improved both your imagination and powers of observation, he remarked. Yes, I agree. Devtoj Babu is certainly physically capable of striking someone with a sword. But consider this. Whoever took that sword knew Mr. Sengupta had gone to the forest. So he deliberately took the weapon, followed him. Don't forget it was a stormy night. Found him, and then killed him. Could a madman have thought all this out and acted upon it, especially when it meant finding his way in the dark in inclement weather, then holding the torch in one hand and using the sword with the other? No, I don't think so. What is essential now is a return visit to the forest, and seeing if we can pick up a clue. There's no point in speculating here. The only thing I'm sure of is that Mr. Sengupta had gone into the forest to look for the hidden treasure. Perhaps he wanted to collect it and take it back to Calcutta. But what still doesn't make sense is why he was so sorely tempted in the first place. He was living here very comfortably, and was clearly very well paid. Did you see his clothes and toiletries? Everything was expensive and of good quality. Even the cigarettes he smoked were imported. Lalmohan Babu shook his head and declared he was now ready for bed. I fell asleep soon after this, but Feluda stayed awake for a long time. I woke to find the sky overcast once again, and Feluda dressed and ready. Then we heard the sound of a jeep arriving, and a servant came up to say we were wanted in the drawing room. Inspector Biswas was waiting for us. Are you happy now? He asked Feluda. Why should I be happy? You found a mystery, didn't you? The murderer took the weapon from this house and finished his victim with it. Isn't that great news? It is true that a sword is missing. But surely you are not assuming that the same sword was used to kill Mr. Sengupta, just because it is no longer there? No, I'm not assuming anything at all. But what about you? Didn't the thought cross your mind? Both men were speaking politely, but it was obvious that a silent undercurrent of rivalry was flowing between them. This was quite unnecessary. I felt cross with the inspector. It was he who had started it. Feluda lit a cigarette and spoke quietly. I haven't yet reached any conclusion. And if you think I'm happy about any aspect of this case, you are quite wrong. Murder never makes me happy, particularly when it is the murder of a young and clever man. A clever man? Mr. Biswas jeered openly. Why should a clever man leave the comforts of his room and go walking in a dark forest in the middle of the night? What's so clever about that? Can you find a satisfactory answer to this question, Mr. Mitter? Yes, I can. All the three men present in the room, apart from ourselves, seemed to stiffen at Feluda's words. There was a very good reason for Mr. Sengupta's visit to the forest that night, Feluda said clearly, looking at Maitosh Babu. I have worked out the meaning of the puzzle you showed me. But Torit Sengupta had done the same, long before me. That tiger skin should really have gone to him. It is my belief that he was in the forest looking for the treasure. Maitosh Babu opened his mouth to speak, but could not find any words. His eyes nearly popped out. Feluda hurriedly explained about the puzzle and how he had discovered its meaning. But Maitosh Babu continued to look perplexed. The tree of the toothless fakir? He said, surprised. Why, I have never heard of it. Really? But your brother told us you used to go for picnics with your grandfather when you were both small. He said you sat under that tree. My brother? Maitosh Babu said a little scornfully. Do you realize how much fact there is in what my brother says, and how much of it is fiction? Don't forget, he isn't normal. Feluda could not say anything in reply. How could he possibly comment on Maitosh Babu's brother's illness? After all, he was only an outsider. Maitosh Babu, however, had now started to look openly distressed. This means Torit was planning to run away to Calcutta with my treasure? And I had no idea. Mr. Biswas stood up, curling his right hand into a fist. Then he struck his left palm with it and said, Well, at least we know why he was in the forest. That's one problem solved. Now we must find his assassin. It has to be someone from this house. I hope you realize that, Mr. Biswas. Feluda blew out a smoke ring. Mr. Biswas gave a twisted smile. Sure, he replied, narrowing his eyes. But that would have to include you. You had seen the sword. You knew where it was kept. You had every opportunity to remove it, just like the others in this house. We don't know whether you knew Torit Sengupta before you came here, or whether there was any enmity between the two of you. Do we? Feluda sent another smoke ring floating in the air. You're right, he said. No one knows anything about that. However, everyone is aware of two things. One, I was invited here. I did not come on my own. Two, I was the one who pointed out that Mr. Sengupta had been attacked by a sharp instrument. If I didn't, people would have assumed a wild animal had killed him, and no further questions would have been asked. Mr. Biswas laughed unexpectedly. Relax, Mr. Mitter, he said. Why are you taking me so seriously? Don't worry, we are not interested in you. Someone else concerns us far more. I noticed that when he said this, he exchanged a glance with Maitosh Babu, just for a fleeting second. You told me something yesterday, Mr. Biswas. Does that still stand? Feluda asked. What did I tell you? Can I continue with my own investigation? Of course, but we must not clash with each other, you know. We won't. I wish to confine myself to working in the forest. You are not interested in that, are you? The inspector shrugged. As you wish, he said carelessly. Feluda turned to Maitosh Babu. You mean to say there is absolutely no point in talking to your brother? Maitosh Roy seemed to clench his jaw at this question. Was he perhaps beginning to lose his patience? However, when he spoke, he sounded perfectly friendly. My brother seems to have taken a turn for the worse, he explained quietly. I really don't think he should be disturbed. Feluda stubbed his cigarette out in an ashtray and stood up. Well, I can hardly remain here indefinitely as your guest. Tomorrow will be the last day of our visit. May we go to the forest today? If you could please tell Madhavlal and get us a jeep. Maitosh Babu nodded. It was now 8:30. We decided to leave by 10 o'clock. Feluda and I had brought hunting boots to walk in the forest. We put these on, although I had a feeling I wouldn't be allowed to climb out of the jeep at all. I had expected Lalmohan Babu to say he had no wish to leave the jeep, but, to my surprise, he disappeared into the bathroom and changed into khaki trousers. Then he took out a pair of rather impressive sturdy boots from his suitcase and began to slip them on. Feluda gave him a sidelong glance, but made no comment. Felu Babu, Lalmohan Babu began, marching up and down in his new boots in military style. Is it true what they say about a tiger's eyes? I mean, the look in its eyes is supposed to be absolutely terrifying, or so I've heard. Could it be true? Feluda was staring out of the window, waiting to be told that Madhavlal and the jeep had arrived. We were all ready to leave. Yes, I've heard the same, he replied. But do you know what some famous shikaris have said? Tigers are just as afraid of men. If a man can manage to return a tiger's stare and just stand with a steady eye contact, the tiger would make an about turn and go away. And if simply a stare doesn't help, then screaming and shouting and waving may produce the same result. But what about a man-eater? That's different. I see. So why are you... Why am I going? I'm going because the chances of the tiger coming out during the day are virtually nil. Even if it does appear, we will have a rifle to deal with it. Besides, we'll have the jeep, so we can always make a quick escape if need be. Lalmohan Babu did not say another word until the jeep arrived. When it did, he simply said, I can't understand anything about this murder. Nothing makes sense. I'm in total darkness. Efforts are being made to make sure we do not see the light, Lalmohan Babu. It should be our job to foil every attempt. Chapter 9. We reached the spot where Mr. Sengupta's body had been found. The clouds having dispersed, it was much brighter today. Sunlight streamed through the leaves to form little patterns on the ground here and there. There also appeared to be many more birds chirping in the trees. Lalmohan Babu gave a start each time he heard a bird call, thinking it was an alarm call for an approaching tiger. The body had been removed the same day. Taurid Babu's family in Calcutta had been informed, and his brother had arrived to take care of the funeral. There was no sign left of that hideous incident near the bamboo grove. Even then, Feluda began inspecting the ground closely, assisted by Madhavlal. The more I saw Madhavlal, the more I liked him. He seemed a cheerful fellow. He smiled often, which made deep creases appear on both sides of his mouth. Even when he didn't smile, his eyes twinkled. He told us on the way that the news of the man-eater had spread through people in the forest department. Apparently, a number of shikaris had offered to kill it. Among them was a Mr. Sapru, who had killed many tigers and other animals in the Terai. He was expected to arrive the next day. Now he stopped to chat with us and began telling us stories of the many expeditions he had been on. At this moment, Feluda called him from the bamboo grove. Madhavlal stopped his tale and went forward quickly, closely followed by Lalmohan Babu and myself. Feluda had raised no objection today to our getting out of the jeep. We found him kneeling on the ground, bending over a bamboo stem. "Take a look at this," he said to Madhavlal. Madhavlal glanced at it briefly and declared, "It was hit by a bullet, sir." There was a mark on the stem which I now saw. All of us, including Feluda, felt astounded. "Can you tell me how old that mark might be?" Feluda asked, a little impatiently. "Not older than a couple of days," Madhavlal replied. "What can it mean?" Feluda muttered, half to himself. "A sword? A gun? I'm getting all confused. Torit Sengupta was struck by the sword. Then someone shot at the tiger but missed, by the look of things. Or else—" He broke off. Madhavlal had found something under the bamboo. I saw what it was only when I got closer. He was clutching what looked like fluff, about 2 inches in length. "Hair from the tiger's body?" Feluda asked. "Yes, sir. The bullet must have scraped one side." "Is that why the tiger ran away without finishing its meal?" "Looks like it." Feluda began moving forward without another word. Madhavlal followed him, rifle in hand, his eyes alert. Lalmohan Babu and I placed ourselves between these two men, which struck us as the safest thing to do. Feluda was carrying a loaded revolver, but that wasn't enough to deal with the man-eater. The sound of an engine starting told me the driver of our jeep was following us. It meant that he would get closer, although he couldn't actually be by our side, for we had left the road and were now amidst the trees and bushes. 3 minutes later, Feluda appeared to notice something on a thorny bush, and quickly made his way to it, walking diagonally to the right. There was a piece of green cloth stuck to it, which had undoubtedly come from Mr. Sengupta's shirt. The tiger had obviously come this way carrying his body, and the shirt had got stuck on that bush. When we started walking again, Madhavlal took the lead. He could probably guess which way the man-eater had come from. He moved with extreme caution, partly because we were behind him, and partly because the area abounded with briar and other prickly plants. He stopped abruptly under a large tamarind tree, looking closely at the ground. We gathered round him and saw what had caught his attention. I had never seen such a thing before, but knew instantly I was looking at a pugmark. There were several others that seemed to have come from the same direction we were now going in. Lalmohan Babu whispered, "Is this a two-legged tiger?" Madhavlal laughed. "No," Feluda explained. "This is how a tiger walks. It puts its hind legs exactly where it puts its forelegs, so it seems as if it's a two-legged animal." Madhavlal continued walking. I could no longer hear the jeep. A faint gurgling noise told me there was a nullah somewhere in the vicinity. Lalmohan Babu's new boots, which had been squeaking rather loudly at first, ideal for arousing the man-eater's curiosity, Feluda had remarked, were now silent, being heavily streaked with mud. We passed a silk cotton tree, and then Madhavlal stopped again. "You have a revolver, sir?" "Don't you?" he asked Feluda. His voice was low. A few yards ahead of us, something was emerging from the long grass, parting it to make its way. "Krait," Madhavlal said softly. I had read about krites. They were extremely poisonous snakes. A second later, it came into view and stopped. It was black, striped with yellow. It had no hood. I did not see Feluda take out his revolver, but heard the ear-splitting noise as he fired it. The head of the snake disappeared, and it was all over. A number of birds cried out, and a group of monkeys grew rather agitated, but the body of the snake lay still. "Shabash," said Madhavlal. Ram Babu made a noise that appeared to be a mixture of laughter, a sneeze, and a cough. We resumed walking. The forest was not thick everywhere. The trees thinned to our left. "That's where the Nala is," Madhavlal said, "and the area is rocky. Tigers often rest there during the day behind rocks and boulders. I suggest we walk straight on." We took his advice. Feluda was still looking round everywhere, hoping for more clues. This time, Lalmohan Babu helped him find one, purely by accident. He stumbled against something and kicked it, making it spring up in the air and land a few feet away. It was a dark brown leather wallet. Feluda picked it up and opened it. There were 200 rupee notes and a few smaller ones. Besides these, in the smaller compartments were 2 folded old stamps, cash memos, and a prescription. The wallet was wet and dirty, but the money inside could be used quite easily. Feluda put everything back in the wallet, then put it in his pocket. We began walking again. The trees had suddenly grown very thick. Almost unconsciously, I began to look for a peepul tree. I knew Feluda was doing the same. I did see a couple of peepuls, but there were no palms near them. Madhavlal had stopped for a minute to cut 2 small branches from a tree, which he passed then on to Lalmohan Babu and me. We were now using these as walking sticks. "A pug mark can tell you a lot about the size of the tiger, can't it?" Feluda asked. "Yes, sir," Madhavlal replied. "Our man-eater appears to be a big fellow." Feluda asked another question. "Mahitosh Babu has never killed anything in this forest, has he?" "No, sir. Many shikaris have superstitions. Mahitosh Babu is no exception. My own father did. Once he happened to brush against a stinging nettle just as he set off from home. He killed a 10-foot tiger that day. From then on, every time he went on shikar, he used to rub his hands on stinging nettle, no matter how much it hurt. Jim Corbett was superstitious too. If he could see a snake before going off to look for a tiger, that used to make him happy. If his grandfather and father had both been killed here, it was entirely understandable why Mahitosh Babu had taken himself off to Assam and Orissa. 20 minutes later, Feluda finally found what he was really looking for. Telling Madhavlal to stop, he began peering behind a thick bush, which was laden with small purple flowers. We joined him and saw it. The stone-studded handle of Aditya Narayan's sword was visible just outside the bush. The blade was hidden behind it. Feluda picked it up in one swooping movement. The blade was stained with blood, although the stains had faded to some degree. Feluda turned it over and inspected the handle closely. "Madhavlalji," he said, "the actual spot where the murder took place cannot be far from here. Can we walk on?" "Sure." But 100 yards from here you'll find a temple." "A temple?" Feluda asked sharply. "Yes, sir. The locals call it the Temple of the Chopped Goddess. There's nothing left in it, only the basic structure is still standing somehow." None of us said anything. Behind this temple was the tree of the toothless fakir, and 55 yards to the east. Without a word, Feluda strode ahead, the sword in his hand, as though he was Sher Shah out to destroy a tiger. Madhavlal was right about the temple. It was certainly an ancient building, its walls broken and cracked. Plants had grown out of the cracks. Roots from a banyan tree hung down from all sides, as if they wanted to crush what was left of the roof. What must have been the inner sanctum was still there, but it was so dark inside that I didn't think there was any question of going in. Feluda, however, was not looking at the temple at all. He was staring behind it. About 20 yards away, just as Devtosh Babu had said, stood a large, old peepal tree. Its branches were dry, shriveled and bare. There were virtually no leaves left. But what the tree did have, visible even from a distance, was a big hollow, at least 5 feet up from the ground. We followed Feluda in breathless anticipation. As we got closer, we saw to our amazement that funny marks and patches on the tree trunk near the hollow, together with its uneven surface, had truly helped create the appearance of an old, toothless man with a gaping mouth. "Is that the east?" Feluda asked, turning his eyes to the right. "Yes, sir," Madhavlal replied. "Look, the 2 palms. And I don't think I need even bother with measuring the distance. It's got to be 55 paces." The 2 palms were clearly visible, 55 yards away. We moved towards them and spotted it almost immediately. The ground between the palms had been dug quite recently. There was a fairly large hole, now filled with water. Any treasure that might have been there had gone. "What? Hidden treasure vanished?" Lalmohan Babu was the first to find his tongue. He forgot to whisper. Feluda was looking grim again, although what he had just seen could hardly be regarded as a new mystery. Whoever killed Mr. Sengupta had obviously removed the treasure. Feluda stared at the hole in the ground for a few seconds, then said, "Why don't you rest for a while? I'd like to make a quick survey." My legs were aching after walking stealthily for such a long time. I was quite thankful for this chance to rest, and so was Lalmohan Babu. We found a dry area under the peepal tree and sat down. Madhavlal put his rifle down, placing it against the tree trunk, and began to tell us a story of how he had been attacked by a bear when he was 13, and how he had managed to escape. But I couldn't give him my full attention, for my eyes kept following Feluda. He lit a cigarette, placed it between his lips, and began examining the ground around the ancient temple. I saw him pick something up, possibly a cigarette stub, and then drop it again. Then he knelt and bent low to look closely at the ground, his face almost touching it. After 10 minutes of close scrutiny outside, Feluda went into the dark hall. I could only marvel at his courage. The temple was probably crawling with snakes and other reptiles. When the temple was in use, it was supposed to have had a statue of Durga. Kalapahar chopped off its head and 4 of its 10 arms, hence its current name. Feluda emerged a minute later and made a rather cryptic remark. "This is amazing," he exclaimed. "Who knew one would have to step into the darkness in order to see the light?" What, Felu Babu? Do you mean the darkness has gone? Lal Mohan Babu shouted. Partly, yes. You might call it the first night after a moonless one. Oh, that would mean waiting for a whole fortnight to get a full moon. No, Lal Mohan Babu. You were only thinking of the moon. There is such a thing as the sun, remember? It comes out at the end of each dark night, doesn't it? You mean to say tomorrow we might see the climax of the story? The end? I am saying nothing of the kind, Lal Mohan Babu. All I'm prepared to tell you is that, after hours of darkness, I think I'm beginning to see a glimmer of light. Come on, Topshe, let's go home. Chapter 10. We had left the house at 10 o'clock. By the time we got back, it was 12:30. Feluda wanted to return the sword to Maitosh Babu, but we discovered on our return that he had gone with Mr. Sanyal to visit the head of the forest department in the forest bungalow in Kolbani. So we went to our room, taking the sword with us. Before we did this, however, we spent some time on the ground floor. Feluda went to the trophy room. I could not tell what he was thinking, but he began to examine all the guns that were displayed there. He picked up each one and inspected its barrel, its butt, trigger, and safety catch. Lal Mohan Babu began to ask him something, but Feluda told him to be quiet. This is a time to think, Lal Mohan Babu, he said, not to chat. By this time, Lal Mohan Babu had become quite familiar with Feluda's moods, so he promptly shut up. Feluda finished inspecting the trophy room and turned to go upstairs. We followed silently. He spoke again on reaching the veranda on the first floor. What's this? He asked, stopping suddenly and staring at Devtosh Babu's room. Why is the elder brother's room locked? There was a padlock on the door. Where could he have gone? Why had he left the room locked? Feluda said nothing more. We reached our room. Feluda spent the next few minutes sitting quietly, frowning. Then he got up and paced restlessly, stopped short and sat down again. 2 minutes later, he was back on his feet. I knew this mood well. He always acted like this as he got closer to unraveling a complex mystery. Since there is no one about, and Devtosh Babu's room is locked, he said suddenly, it might not be a bad idea to do a bit of snooping. He left the room. I stuck my head out of the door and saw him go into Maitosh Babu's study. I came back into our room to find Lal Mohan Babu stretched on the leopard skin on the floor. He was using its head as a pillow. Clearly, seeing a tiger's pug mark in the forest had gone a long way to boost his courage. After a few seconds of silence, he remarked, Thank goodness I thought of dedicating my book to Satyajit Roy. Could we ever have had such a thrilling experience if I hadn't? Just take this morning. A bullet in a bamboo grove, a snake in the grass, pug marks of a Royal Bengal, a ruined old temple, a famous peepal tree. What more could anyone want? All that's left to make the experience complete is an encounter with the man-eater. Do you really want that? I asked. I'm not scared any more, he replied, yawning noisily. If you have Madhavlal on one side and Felu Mitter on the other, no man-eater can do anything to you. He closed his eyes and seemed to go to sleep. I picked up Maitosh Babu's book and had read a few pages when Feluda returned. His footsteps made Lal Mohan Babu open his eyes and sit up. Did you find anything? No. I did not find what I was looking for, but that is what is significant. After a brief pause, Feluda asked, "Do you remember why Yudhishthir's chariot got stuck to the ground?" "Because he told a lie?" "Exactly. But these days, a liar doesn't always get punished by God. Other men have to catch and punish him." I could not ask him what he meant, for a jeep arrived as he finished speaking. Only a few minutes later, a servant turned up to say Maitosh Babu had returned and lunch had been served. Despite all that had happened, we had enjoyed our meals every day. Maitosh Babu obviously had a very good cook. Today, the food looked inviting enough, but our host began a conversation on a rather sombre note. "Mr. Mitter," he said solemnly, "since you have discovered the meaning of Adityanaran's message, I don't think I have the right to keep you here any longer. If you like, I can make arrangements for your return. One of my men is going to Jalpaiguri. He can book your tickets for you." Feluda did not reply immediately. Then he said slowly, "I was thinking of going back myself. You have been an excellent host, but naturally we cannot stay here indefinitely. But, if you don't mind, I'd like to stay here tonight and leave tomorrow morning. You see, I'm a detective, and there has been a murder. I'm sure you will appreciate why I want to stay a bit longer to see if any light can be thrown on the case. It is immaterial whether I can discover the truth or the police do their job. I only want to know what happened and how it happened." Maitosh Babu stopped eating and looked straight at Feluda. "There is no one in this house who would plan a murder in cold blood, Mr. Mitter," he said firmly. Feluda paid no attention. "Where is your brother?" he asked casually. "Has he been taken somewhere else? His room was locked." Maitosh Babu replied in the same grave tone, "My brother is in his room. But since last night, his ailment has become worse. He has to be restrained, or he might cause serious damage to whoever came his way, yourself included. Sometimes he starts imagining he has seen people who died hundreds of years ago. You know, characters out of a history book. Then he attacks them if he thinks they did anything wrong in the past. Once he mistook Torit for Kalapahar and nearly throttled him to death. One of the servants saw him, luckily, and managed to take him away." Feluda continued to eat. "Did you know," he said conversationally, "the death of Mr. Sengupta is not the only mystery we are dealing with? Someone ran off with your treasure, possibly the same night." "What?" Maitosh Babu turned into a statue, holding his food a few inches from his mouth. "You mean you went and checked?" "Yes, the treasure is gone, but we found the sword with bloodstains on it." Maitosh Babu opened his mouth to speak, but could only gulp in silence. Feluda dropped the third bombshell. "When the tiger attacked Mr. Sengupta, someone shot at the tiger. The bullet hit a bamboo stem, but it is likely that it grazed the tiger's body, for we found a few strands of hair. So it seems Torit Sengupta was not the only one who had gone to the forest that night. Different people with different purposes in mind." "Poacher," Mr. Sanyal spoke unexpectedly. "It must have been a poacher who entered the forest after Torit was killed. It was this poacher who shot at the tiger." Feluda nodded slowly. "That possibility cannot be ruled out. So for the moment, we need not worry about where the bullet came from. However, we still have the blood-stained sword and the missing treasure to explain. Never mind the sword. The treasure is far more important, Maitosh Babu declared. Mr. Mitter, we've got to find it. The history of the family of Sinha Roys will remain incomplete unless it is found. Very well, Feluda suggested. If that is the case, why don't we all return to the spot later today? It is very close to the temple of the chopped goddess. Maitosh Babu agreed to accompany us back to the forest. However, torrential rain, which began at 3:30 and continued well after 6, forced us to abandon our plan. Feluda had been looking withdrawn. Now he looked positively depressed. It was obvious that Maitosh Babu wanted us to leave. If the weather did not improve the next day, we might well have to go back without solving the mystery surrounding Mr. Sengupta's death. How another visit to the temple could make a difference, I could not tell, but I knew Feluda was definitely onto something. The occasional glint in his eyes told me that very clearly. Unable to sit in our room doing nothing, we came out and stood on the veranda when the grandfather clock struck 5. The door to Devtosh Babu's room was still locked. "There's no one round," Lalmohn Babu whispered. "Why don't we try looking through the shutters? What can the man be doing?" Like many of Lalmohn Babu's other suggestions, Feluda ignored this one. The sky cleared after 7. When the stars came out, they looked as if someone had polished them before pasting them on an inky black sky. Feluda sat on his bed, holding the sword. Lalmohn Babu and I were standing at the window, admiring the stars, when suddenly he clutched at my sleeve and said in a low voice, "A small torch!" The chowkidar's hut was visible from our window. There was a large tree near it. A man was standing under it. Another man, carrying a torch, was approaching him. His torch was of the kind that can be plugged into an electric socket and recharged. It had a small bulb and an equally small point, but the light it gave out was very bright. Feluda switched the light off in our room and joined us at the window. "Madhavlal," he murmured. I, too, had recognized the man who had been waiting under the tree as Madhavlal, for I could vaguely see his yellow shirt even in the dark. But it was impossible to see the other man. It could have been Maitosh Babu, his brother, Mr. Sanyal, or someone else. The torch was switched off, but the two men were still standing outside, talking. After a while, the yellow shirt moved away. The torchlight came back on and returned to the house. Feluda waited for a few seconds before switching on our own light. Lalmohn Babu was probably carrying out an investigation on his own. I saw him slip out to the veranda and return a moment later. "What did you see? Is that door still locked?" Feluda asked. Lalmohn Babu gave an embarrassed laugh. "Yes," he replied. "Did you really think it was Devtosh Babu who was speaking with Madhavlal?" "Yes. I told you I did not trust him. A madman must not be trusted. We used to have one where I live. He was often seen standing in the middle of the road, throwing stones at passing trams and buses. Just think how dangerous that was." "What did the locked door prove?" "That he didn't go down just now." "How can you be so sure?" "Have you heard any noises from that room today? How do you know that room isn't empty?" Lalmohn Babu began to look rather crestfallen. "Felu Babu, I try so hard to follow your methods and work on the same lines as you, but somehow I get it all wrong. That is only because you work in reverse gear. You pick your criminal first, then try to dump the crime on him. I try to understand the nature of the crime before looking for the person who might have committed it. Are you doing the same in this case? Of course. There is no other way. But where did you start from? Kurukshetra. After this, Lal Mohan Babu did not dare ask another question. When I went to bed that night, I had no problem in falling asleep, for the mosquito nets had been changed. But, in the middle of the night, a sudden shout woke me. I sat up, startled, to find Feluda standing in the middle of the room, clutching Aditinarayan's sword. Moonlight poured in through an open window, making the weapon shine brightly. Feluda looked steadily at the metal blade and repeated the word he had just spoken very loudly. Only, this time he lowered his voice. Eureka! Eureka! He said. Thousands of years ago, Archimedes had said the same thing when he had found what he was looking for. There was no way of telling what Feluda had discovered. Chapter 11. Mr. Sanyal arrived in our room the following morning, just as we finished our bed tea. What did he want so early in the morning? I looked at him in surprise, but Feluda greeted him warmly. We haven't really had the chance to get to know each other, have we? He said, offering our visitor a seat. As Maitosh Babu's friend, you must have had a lot of interesting experiences yourself. Mr. Sanyal took a chair opposite the table. Yes, I have known Maitosh for 50 years, since our school days. May I ask you something? About Maitosh? No, about Torit Sengupta. Yes? What sort of a man was he? I mean, what was your impression? He was a very good man. I found him intelligent, diligent, and very patient. How was he at his work? Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Yes, I got that impression myself. Mr. Sanyal gave Feluda a level look. I have come to make a request, Mr. Mitter, he said simply. A request? Feluda asked, offering him a cigarette. Mr. Sanyal accepted it and waited until it had been lit for him. I saw him smoking for the first time. He inhaled deeply before replying. Yes, you have seen a lot in the last 3 days, he said. You are far more clever than ordinary men, so obviously you have drawn your own conclusions from what you have seen. Today is probably the last day of your stay. No one knows what the day has in store. No matter what happens today, Mr. Mitter, I'd be very grateful if you could keep it to yourself. I'm sure Maitosh would want the same thing. If you look at the history of any old family in Bengal, particularly the Zamindars, I'm sure you'll find a lot of skeletons in their cupboards. The Sinha Roys are no exception. However, I see no reason why the facts that come to light should be made public. I'm making the same appeal to your friend and to your cousin. Mr. Sanyal, Feluda replied, I have enjoyed Maitosh Babu's hospitality for 3 days. I'm very grateful to him for his generosity. I can never go back to Calcutta and start maligning him. None of us could do that. I give you my word. Mr. Sanyal nodded silently. Then Feluda asked another question, possibly because he couldn't help himself. Devtosh Babu's room is still locked. Can you explain why? Mr. Sanya looked a little oddly at Feluda. By the end of this day, Mr. Mitter, the reason will become clear to you. I take it that the police are still working on this case? No. What? Why not? Well, suspicion has fallen on someone, but Maitosh does not want the police to harass this person at all. You mean Devtosh Babu? Yes, who else could I mean? But even if that's true, even if he did kill, he's not going to be charged or punished in the usual way, is he? I mean, considering his medical condition? Yes, you're probably right. Nevertheless, the news would spread, wouldn't it? Maitosh doesn't want that to happen. Simply to save the good name of his family? Yes, that's the reason, Mr. Mitter. Let's just leave it at that, shall we? Mr. Sanyal rose and left. We left at 8:30. There were 2 jeeps once again, like the first day. Feluda, Lalmohan Babu and I were in one, and the other were Maitosh Babu, Mr. Sanyal, Madhavlal, and a bearer called Parvat Singh. There were 3 rifles with us today. Madhavlal has his, Maitosh Babu had another, and the third was with Feluda. He himself had asked for a rifle. Having heard from Madhavlal how he had killed the snake with his revolver, Maitosh Babu had raised no objection. You can choose whatever you like, he had said. The 375 would be suitable for a tiger. I did not understand what the number signified, but could see that the rifle was most impressive in size, and probably also in weight. As a matter of fact, I was the only one who was not armed. Feluda had handed the sword to Lalmohan Babu this morning, saying, "Hang on to it. This sword has an important role to play today. You'll soon get to see what I mean." Lalmohan Babu was therefore clutching it tightly, wearing an air of suppressed excitement. When we woke this morning, the sky was clear, but now it had started to cloud over again. The road being muddy and slippery, we took longer to reach the forest. Each driver took his jeep 1/2 mile further into the forest than the last time, but then could go no further. "Never mind," Madhavlal said. "I know the way. We have to cross a nalla and walk for 15 minutes to get to the temple." We began our journey amidst the rustle of leaves, a cool breeze, and the occasional rumble in the sky. Feluda loaded his gun before getting out of the jeep. Maitosh Babu's gun was being carried by Parvat Singh. Apparently, he had always accompanied his master on hunting expeditions. A short but well-built man, he clearly did not lack physical strength. I saw a herd of deer in a few minutes. A sudden surge of joy filled my heart, but then it leapt in fear. Somewhere in this forest, perhaps not very far away, was a man-eater. Normally, a tiger could easily walk more than 20 miles and travel from one forest to another to look for a prey. But if it was injured, it might not be able to walk very far. In any case, the forest here was not all that big. Large areas of woodland had been cleared to make tea estates and farms. Besides, although tigers didn't usually come out of hiding during the day, they were likely to do so if the day was dark and cloudy. This was something I had learned from Feluda only this morning. Soon we came to the nalla. It had probably been quite dry even a day ago, but now was gurgling merrily. A lot of animals had left their footprints on the wet sand by its sides. Madhavlal pointed out the marks left by deer, wild boars, and a hyena, but there was no sign of a tiger. We crossed it and continued to walk. I could hear a whoopee in the distance. A peacock cried out once, and there were crickets in the bushes we passed. The faint rustling noise in the grass told me lizards and other smaller reptiles were quickly moving out of our way to avoid being crushed to death under our feet. The route we took today was a different one, but it did not take us very long to reach the spot we had visited yesterday. There was the bush with the purple flowers. That was where we had found the sword. Madhavlal moved silently, and each one of us tried to do the same. Actually, it was not all that difficult to muffle the noise our feet made, for the ground was wet and there were no dry leaves. Piles of broken bricks came into view. We had reached the temple of the chopped goddess. No one spoke. Madhavlal stopped in front of the temple. We joined him noiselessly. Since my attention had been wholly taken up the day before by the peepal tree and the 2 palms, I hadn't noticed the other big trees in the area. A cool breeze now wafted through their leaves, and the Nala still rippled faintly in the background. Feluda walked over to the palms. Maitosh Babu followed him swiftly. The hole in the ground was even more full of water today. After a while, Feluda broke the silence. "This is where Adityanarayan had hidden his treasure," he said. "But where did it go?" Maitosh Babu asked hoarsely. "It has not gone far, unless someone removed it yesterday after we left." Maitosh Babu's eyes began gleaming with hope. "Do you really think so? Are you sure?" he asked eagerly. Feluda turned to face him squarely. "Maitosh Babu, can you tell us what that treasure consists of? What exactly was buried under the ground?" Maitosh Babu's face had gone red with excitement. A couple of veins stood out on his forehead. "I don't know, Mr. Mitter, but I can guess." He spoke with an effort. "One of my ancestors, called Yashwant Singh Roy, was the chief of the army in the princely state of Cooch Behar. The money he had been paid by the Maharaja was kept in our house. There were more than 1,000 silver coins, 400 years old. When Adityanarayan decided to hide these, he had crossed 60 and was beginning to lose his mind. He had started to indulge in childish pranks. No one could find those coins after he died. Now, after all these years, his coded message has told us where they were hidden. I can't afford to lose them again, Mr. Mitter. I've got to find them." Feluda turned from Maitosh Babu and began walking towards the temple. He stopped for a second as he passed me, and said, "Here, Topshe, hold my rifle for me. I don't think I'll need it inside that hole. A revolver should be good enough." My hand started to tremble, but I pulled myself together and took the rifle from him. Then I realized just how heavy it was. Feluda walked on and entered the dark hall once more. I saw him put his hand into his pocket before he disappeared through its broken door. In less than 5 seconds, we heard him fire twice. No one said anything, but I could feel a shiver go down my spine. Then Feluda's voice spoke from inside the temple. "Maitosh Babu, could you please send your bearer here?" Parvat Singh handed the rifle to his master and went into the temple. A couple of seconds later, he emerged with a dirty, muddy brass pitcher in his hands. Feluda followed him. Maitosh Babu rushed forward towards his bearer. "Who knew a cobra would be attracted to silver coins?" Feluda said with a smile. "I had heard its hiss yesterday. Today I found it wound round that pitcher, as if it was giving it a tight embrace. Maitosh Babu had thrown aside his rifle. I saw him pounce upon the pitcher and put his hand into it. Just as he brought it out, clutching a handful of coins, an animal cried out nearby. It was a barking deer. Monkeys joined it immediately, jumping from branch to branch, making an incessant noise. A lot of things happened at once. Even now, as I write about it, I feel shaken and confused. To start with, a remarkable change came over Maitosh Babu. Only a moment ago, he had seemed overjoyed at the sight of his treasure. Now, he dropped the coins, jumped up and took 3 steps backwards, as if he had received an electric shock. Each one of us turned into a statue. Feluda was the first to speak, but his voice was low. "Topshe," he whispered, "climb that tree. You too, Lalmohn Babu. Go on, be quick." We were standing near the famous peepul tree. I returned the rifle to Feluda, placed a foot in the big hollow, and grasped a branch. In about 10 seconds, I was a good 10 feet from the ground. Lalmohn Babu followed suit, with surprising agility, having passed me the sword. Soon, he was sitting on a branch higher than mine. He told us afterwards that he had had a lot of practice in climbing trees as a child, but I had no idea he could do it even at the age of 40. I saw what followed from the treetop. Lalmohn Babu saw some of it, then fainted quietly. But his arms and legs were so securely wrapped around a big branch that he did not fall down. It was obvious to everyone that there was a tiger in the vicinity. That was why Feluda had told us to get out of the way. Maitosh Babu's reaction was the most surprising. I could never have imagined he would behave like that. He turned to Feluda and spoke fiercely through clenched teeth. "Mr. Mitter, if you value your own life, go away at once." "Go away? Where could I go, Maitosh Babu?" Both men were holding their rifles. Maitosh Babu raised his, pointing it at Feluda. "Go," he said again. "The jeep is still waiting, over there. Get out of here. I command you." He couldn't finish. His voice was drowned by the roar of a tiger. It sounded as if not one, but 50 wild animals had cried out together. Then I saw a flash of yellow, like a moving flame, through the leaves of the trees that stood behind the temple. It moved swiftly through the tall grass and all the undergrowth, and slowly took the shape of a huge striped animal, a Royal Bengal tiger. It began making its way to the open area where the others were still standing. Maitosh Babu lowered his gun. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. Feluda raised his own rifle. There were 3 other men, Shashank Sanyal, Madhav Lal, and Parvat Singh. Parvat Singh gave a sudden leap and vanished from sight. I could not see what the other 2 were doing, for my eyes kept moving between Feluda and the tiger. It was now standing beside the temple. It bared its fangs and growled. Never before had it such a wide choice of prey. Then I saw it stop and crouch. It would spring up and attack perhaps in less than a second. I had read about this. Sometimes a tiger could... Bang! Bang! Shots rang out almost simultaneously from 2 different rifles. My ears started ringing. Just for a moment, even my vision seemed to blur. But I did not miss seeing what happened to the tiger. It shot up in the air, then seemed to strike against an invisible barrier, which made it take a somersault and drop to the ground. It crashed where the brass pitcher stood, its tail lashing at it, making it turn over noisily, spilling its contents. Then the tiger lay still, surrounded by 400-year-old silver coins. Feluda slowly put his rifle down. "It's dead, sir," Madhavlal announced, sounding pleased. "Who killed it? Which of the 2 bullets did the trick, I wonder?" Feluda asked. Maitosh Babu was in no condition to reply. He was sitting on the ground, clutching his head between his hands. His rifle had been snatched away by his friend Shashank Sanyal. It was he who had fired the second shot. Mr. Sanyal walked over to the dead tiger. "Come and have a look, Mr. Mitter," he invited. One of the bullets caught him under the jaw and went for the head. The other hit him near an ear. Either of those could have killed him. Chapter 12. The sound of double shots had brought the local villagers running to the spot. Thrilled to see their enemy killed, they were now making arrangements to tie the tiger to bamboo poles and carry it to their village. There was no doubt that this was the man-eater, but 2 other bullet marks had been found on its body, one on a hind leg and the other near the jaw. These had clearly made the tiger lose its natural ability to hunt for prey in the wild. Besides, the heavy growth of hair on its jowls indicated it was an old tiger anyway. Perhaps that was another reason why it had become a man-eater. Parvat Singh had returned and helped his master to get up and sit on one of the broken steps of the temple. Maitosh Babu was still looking shaken and was wiping his face frequently. Lalmohan Babu had regained consciousness and climbed down from the tree, with a little assistance from me. Then he had calmly taken the sword back, as though carrying a sword and climbing trees was something he did every day. After a few minutes' silence, Feluda spoke. "Maitosh Babu," he said, "you are worrying unnecessarily. I had already promised Mr. Sanyal I would not disclose any of your secrets. No one will ever find out that you are not a shikari, and that you cannot even hold a gun steadily. I had my suspicions right from the start. Your signature on Lalmohan Babu's letter made me think you were old. So I began to wonder how you could shoot, if you could not even write with a steady hand. Then I thought perhaps your hands had been affected only recently, and all those tales in your books were indeed true. I started to believe this, but something your brother said raised fresh doubts in my mind. Yes, I know most of what he said was irrelevant, but I didn't think he would actually make up a story. On the contrary, what he said often made perfect sense, if one thought about it. He obviously knew you had written books on shikar, and that the whole thing was based on lies. This distressed him very much, which is why he kept talking about Yudhishthir's punishment for telling a lie. He also told me not everyone could be like your grandfather. Not everyone could handle weapons. Yes, they could, Maitosh Babu interrupted, breathing hard and speaking very fast. I killed mynas and sparrows with my airgun when I was 7, from a distance of 50 yards. But... He glanced at the peepal tree. One day, we came here for a picnic, and I climbed that tree. In fact, I was sitting on the same branch where your cousin was sitting a while ago, when my brother suddenly said he could see a tiger coming. I jumped down to see the tiger, and... You broke your arm? Compound fracture, Mr. Sanyal stepped forward. It never really healed properly. I see. And yet you wanted to be known as a shikari, just because that was your family tradition. So you moved from here and went to Assam and Orissa, where no one knew you. It was Mr. Sanyal who killed all those animals, but everyone was convinced you were a worthy successor of your forefathers. Is that right, Maitosh Babu? Yes. Maitosh Babu sighed deeply. That is right. What Shashanka did for his friend is unbelievable. He's a much better shikari than anyone in my family. But recently, were you two drifting apart? Both men were silent. Feluda continued. I hadn't heard of Maitosh Sinha Roy before his books began to be published. Nor, I'm sure, had thousands of others. But when these books came out, Sinha Roy became a famous name, didn't it? He was praised, admired, even revered. And what was his fame based on? Nothing but lies. No one knew the name of Shashanka Sanyal. No one ever would. You had begun to resent this, Mr. Sanyal, hadn't you? You had done a lot for your friend, but perhaps the time had come to draw a line. We heard Maitosh Babu speak very sternly to someone on our first night. I assume he was speaking to you. You two had started to disagree on most things, hadn't you? Neither man made a reply. Feluda stared steadily at Maitosh Babu for a few moments. Very well, he said. I shall take silence for assent. But there is another thing. I suppose silence is the only answer to that as well. Maitosh Babu cast a nervous glance at Feluda. I am now talking of Torit Sengupta, Feluda went on. You never wrote a single line yourself, just as you never killed a single animal. You said something about your manuscript, which made me go and look for it in your study. But I didn't find anything with your handwriting on it. All you ever did was just relate your stories to Mr. Sengupta. It was he who wrote them out beautifully. They were his words, his language, his style. Yet, everyone thought they were yours, and you earned more praise, also as a gifted writer. Yes, it is true that you paid him well and he lived here in great comfort. But how long could he go on seeing someone else take the credit for his talent, his own hard work? Anyone with creative abilities wants to see his efforts appreciated. If he had continued to work for you, there was no way his own name could ever become well known. Disappointed and frustrated, he was probably thinking of leaving. But suddenly you chanced upon that puzzle left by Aditya Narayan, and Mr. Sengupta saw it. It could be that he had already found references to those coins among your grandfather's papers, so he knew what the treasure consisted of. He solved that puzzle and decided to leave with the treasure. He even found it, but then things went horribly wrong. Maitosh Babu struggled to his feet, not without difficulty. Yes, Mr. Mitter, you are quite right in all that you have said, he remarked. It is very painful for me to hear these things. But do tell me this. Who killed Torit? He might have resented, even hated me for what I was doing. But who could have disliked him so intensely? I certainly know of no one. Nor can I imagine who else might have come to the forest that night. Perhaps I can help you there. Maitosh Babu had started to pace. He stopped abruptly at Feluda's words and asked, Can you? Feluda turned to Mr. Sanyal. Didn't you pick up a Winchester rifle from the trophy room that night and come here, Mr. Sanyal? I noticed traces of mud on its butt. Perhaps being a shikari had given him nerves of steel. Mr. Sanyal's face remained expressionless. What if I did, Mr. Mitter? He asked coolly. What exactly are you trying to say? Feluda remained just as calm. I am not suggesting for a moment that you came looking for the hidden treasure, he said. You were and still are loyal to your friend. You would never have cheated him. But is it not true that you knew Mr. Sengupta had solved the puzzle? Yes, Mr. Sanyal replied levelly. I did. As a matter of fact, Torrit had offered me half of the treasure since he felt we were both being deprived in the same way. But I refused. Moreover, I told him more than once not to go into the forest, because of the man-eater. But that night, when I saw the light from his torch, I had to follow him in here. Yes, I took that rifle from the trophy room. When I got here, I found that he had dug the ground and found that pitcher, but there was no sign of him. Then I looked around closely and saw blood on the grass and pug marks. So I quickly put the pitcher away inside the temple and followed the marks up to the bamboo grove. Then there was a flash of lightning, and I saw the tiger crouched over Torrit's body. It was too dark to see clearly, but I shot at it and made it run away. I knew I couldn't do anything to help Torrit. It was too late. However, he broke off. However, that isn't all, is it? Please allow me to finish your story. Correct me if what I say is wrong. I can only guess the details. Very well. You were talking to Madhavlal last night, weren't you? Mr. Sanyal did not deny this. Feluda asked another question. Were you asking him to place a bait for the tiger? See those vultures over the tree? I think they're there because a dead animal is lying under it. A calf, Mr. Sanyal muttered. That means you wanted the tiger to come out today while we were here, so that you could show at least a few people you were the real shikari, not your friend. Is that right? Mr. Sanyal nodded silently. Before Feluda could say anything else, Maitosh Babu came forward and placed a hand on Feluda's shoulder. Mr. Mitter, he pleaded, I'd like to give you something. Please do not refuse. What are you talking about? These coins, this treasure. You are entitled to at least some of it. Please let me... Feluda smiled, looking at Maitosh Babu. No, I don't want your silver coins, he said, but there is something I'd like to take back with me. What is it? Aditya Narayan's sword. Lalmohan Babu walked over to Feluda immediately and handed him the sword. What? Maitosh Babu sounded amazed. You would like that old sword instead of these priceless coins? Yes. In a way, the sword is priceless too. It is not an ordinary sword, Maitosh Babu. No, I don't mean just the history attached to it. There is something else. You mean something to do with Torrit's murder? No, Mr. Sengupta was not murdered. What? You mean he killed himself? No, it was not suicide either. Then what was it, for heaven's sake? Why are you talking in riddles? Maitosh Babu said impatiently, sounding stern once more. No, I'm not talking in riddles. Let me explain what happened. We were so busy looking for a murderer that the obvious answer did not occur to anyone. Mr. Sengupta had removed the sword himself. Really? Why? Because he needed something to dig the ground with. He didn't have time to look for a spade. That sword was handy, so he took it. And then? I'm coming to that, but before I do, I'd like to show you what's so special about it. Feluda stopped and began moving towards Mr. Sanyal with the open sword in his hand. Brave though he was, Mr. Sanyal moved restlessly as Feluda got closer. But Feluda did not hurt him. He merely stretched his arm so that the iron blade could get closer to the point of the gun in Mr. Sanyal's hand. A second later, the two pieces of metal clicked together with a faint noise. Good heavens! What is this? A magnet? Mr. Sanyal cried. Yes, it is now a magnet. I mean the sword, not your gun. Let me point out that when I saw the sword the first time, it was no different from other swords. There were various pieces of metal lying near it, but they were not sticking to the blade. It was magnetized the same night Mr. Sengupta died. How did that happen? Maitosh Babu asked. We were all waiting with bated breath to hear Feluda's explanation. If a person happens to be carrying a piece of metal in his hand when lightning strikes, that piece of metal gets magnetized, Feluda went on. Not only that, it may actually attract the lightning. What happened that night, I think, was this. It started raining as soon as Mr. Sengupta finished digging the ground. He got the pitcher, but had to leave it there. I think he then ran towards that peepal tree to avoid getting wet. He was still carrying the sword, perhaps without even realizing it. Lightning struck the tree only a few seconds later. Mr. Sengupta was lifted off the ground and flung aside under its impact. As he fell, the point of the sword pierced his clothes and left a deep wound in his body, purely by accident. No one killed him. It is my belief that he was already dead when he fell. Then the tiger found him. Maitosh Babu was shaking violently. He looked up and stared at the peepal tree. That's why. That explains it, he said, his voice sounding choked. I was wondering all this while why that tree had suddenly grown so old. We were going back to Calcutta today. The sun was shining brightly, but because of the recent rains, it felt pleasantly cool. We had finished packing and were sitting in our room. Devtosh Babu's room was now unlocked. I could hear his voice from time to time. Lalmohan Babu had grazed a knee while climbing down from the tree. He was placing a strip of sticking plaster on it when a servant arrived, carrying a steel trunk on his head. He put it down on the ground and said Maitosh Babu had sent it. Feluda opened it and revealed a beautiful tiger skin, very carefully packed. There was a letter too. It said, Dear Mr. Mitter, I'm giving you this tiger skin as a token of my gratitude. I should be honored if you accept it. The tiger was killed by my friend Shashank Sanyal in the forest near Sambalpur in 1957. Lalmohan Babu read the letter and said, So you get both the sword and the skin? No, Lalmohan Babu. I'm going to present the tiger skin to you. To me? Why? For your remarkable achievement. I've never known anyone who could lose consciousness on the top of a tree and yet manage to stay put, without crashing to the ground. I would not have thought it possible at all. But you have proved it can be done. Lalmohan Babu waved a dismissive hand. Did I tell you why I fainted in the first place? It was only because of my very lively imagination, Felu Babu. When you mentioned a tiger, do you know what I saw? I saw a burning torch, its orange flame shooting up to the sky. An awful monster sat in the middle of it, pulling evil faces, and I could hear the roar of engines. An aircraft was about to take off, and I knew it was going to land on me. Hey, what else could I do after this, except close my eyes and pass into oblivion? The end.